Good afternoon. My name is Maureen Lemassney, and I want to welcome you to the meeting of the Police Reform Work Group. I welcome not only our members, but also the public who are watching these proceedings. If you're joining us for the first time, our mission is to provide our County Executive Angela Alsobrooks with substantive recommendations that will establish fair practices across the board, maximize transparency, and restore public trust in law enforcement. The work group was not created to decide the merits of any pending or potential litigation, nor will the work group make any factual determinations in regard to any lawsuits or controversies. The work group was created to make recommendations regarding the policies of the Prince George's County Police Department and not to resolve, discuss, or comment upon specific or alleged events. These policies include recruitment and retention, financial management, independent oversight, and internal policies. We've established 5 subcommittees to make recommendations in these areas. These recommendations are now due on December 4th. We have a very interesting program tonight with presentations from the Prince George's County Public Schools, the Baltimore City Police Commissioner, the Department of Human Services, the Maryland Association of School Resource Officers, and the Maryland Coalition to Reform School Discipline. I'll now turn it over to Delegate Washington.
Thank you, Judge Lemassney, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Alonzo Washington, State Delegate for District 22 here in Prince George's County, Maryland, and I serve as co-chair of this Police Reform Work Group. We have been meeting weekly for the past several months to develop innovative structural reforms to our county's police department. We have held presentations and discussions on training, hiring practices, employee retention, citizen complaints, the police department's budget, mental health, police use of force policies, and many more issues. Tonight, we have the opportunity to discuss a hot topic today, which is school resource officers, which has been a very contentious issue over the past few months within the county. We'll be hearing also from SRO leaders, PGCPS officials, and several education advocates on this crucial issue. With that said, we have our first speaker, and I'm excited to have this conversation with you all today with my colleagues on the panel today. Today we have with us Mr. Barry Stanton, who is the COO of the Prince George's County Public School System, who will be presenting first on the school resource officers and security staff overview. Mr. Stanton?
Good evening, everyone. I think I have a PowerPoint, but let me just start out by saying I appreciate being here this evening. Let me just say that my PowerPoint will cover a number of points here. I'm going to provide information about the SROs working in the school system, how many we have, the arrest data that we have, and any complaints that were handled by the Prince George's County Police Department or any SROs that were assigned to our high schools. One thing I just want to clarify is right now in the Prince George's County Public Schools, there are only 33 SROs working in our school system. And they work in the high schools. The rest of our staff are security personnel, and that'll be in the PowerPoint once we can bring that up. We have a total of 66 staff members that have arrest powers in the school system, in addition to the 33 police officers. So what I'm going to do is go over the PowerPoint, and then at that point, if you have any questions, I'll be open for any questions you may have. If we can go to the next slide, please. The next one, everybody knows the school board. The agenda is going to cover the state perspective for school resource officers, the history of school resource officers in the Prince George's County public school system, the memorandum of understanding that we use with the police departments, which includes Prince George's County Police Department, Greenbelt, Hyattsville, Bowie. Then we'll talk a little bit about training of SROs and school security staff. We'll talk about the duties of the SROs. And then one important thing is I'm gonna talk about the issue of arrest powers and what that looks like, and then the roles. We're gonna talk about the type of student charges, just a basic overview, and then the arrest by grade, school level, and gender. I have, as far as the presentation is going to cover the past 3 years. Delegate Washington, I know you asked for additional information, so I do have the additional arrest numbers for the remaining years and some of the race breakdown, and then answering your questions about investigations. So if we can go to the next slide, please. School resource officer from the state perspective, Senate Bill 1265, Maryland Safe to Learn Act of 2018. Again, this bill requires public high schools to have either a school resource officer or plans for adequate law enforcement coverage by the upcoming school year. So at the end of the day, we either have to have school resource officers in our high schools or schools, or we have to have a plan on how we're going to deal with emergencies within our school system. Now, what I say to people is understand we only have 33 school resource officers in our school system. So the only coverage they provide is at the high school level. We also have security officers, which I'll talk about, that also have arrest powers within our school system. And though there are 66 of those. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The history of school resource officers in Prince George's County Public Schools. And I apologize if some of you have already seen this, because I know Mr. O'Neill had completed a presentation before. The first SRO was assigned to Eleanor Roosevelt High School. The second SRO was assigned to Northwestern High School in 1998. Prince George's County Police Department and the Maryland Park Police followed in 1999. On November 8th, 1999, the Hyattsville City Police Department assigned an SRO to Northwestern High School on a full-time basis. So some of the notable information concerning SROs during this time. The first year in 1999, the SROs arrested 48 people. School security during this same time arrested 35 people. And I'll talk about the difference of school security and SROs in a minute. In 1999 and 1999 school year, police responded to Northwestern High School at the time 327 times. 327 times. In 1999 to the year 2000 year, the police, other than the school resource officers, only responded 56 times. This was a reduction of 271 calls, or a reduction of 83%. And pretty much that was because we actually had school resource officers in our schools at that point and in Northwestern High School. Next slide, please. Now, as far as the police departments we have SROs with, we have a memorandum of understanding with all the police agencies. When I was DCAO for public safety under Return Baker, I remember signing a number of these MOUs, so I'm very familiar with them. We have an MOU with the Prince George's County Police Department, the Hyattsville Police Department, the Bowie Police Department, and Greenbelt Police Department. Each department is paid $80,000 per year. Now, I don't know if that number has changed, but that's paid by the county, and there are no direct costs to the Prince George's County Public School System. That MOU is set to expire in June 30th, 2022. So at the end of the day, there is no cost to the public school system for the SROs in our school system. Next slide, please. Training by the SROs under the Safe to Learn Act of 2018, it mandates either the assignment of SROs or adequate law enforcement coverage for each individual school within the state of Maryland. The SROs right now, training curriculum, and let me just say, the training curriculum is approved by the Maryland Police and Correctional Training Commission and also by Prince George's County Police Department and the police agencies where the SROs come from. The curriculum includes de-escalation, disability awareness, maintaining a positive school climate, constructive interaction with students, implicit bias, which Dr. Golson has been really the last few years have been pushing implicit bias, not just from the security side, but throughout the entire school system. And then we deal with disability and diversity awareness within our training. Maryland's SRO training prepares the SROs to fulfill 4 distinct roles within the school community. Role of an educator. That's very important because they're in the schools, they want to help the students prepare. Role of an emergency manager. We have emergencies in the school system, things around the school system, the property, they're responsible for responding. The role of an informal counselor, hopefully they're creating relationships with our students and making sure they create some kind of peer relationship to ensure that the students know they're just not there to be police officers or the role of law enforcement officers. So that's the basic role that they hold within our school community. Next slide, please. So the duties of the school resource officer. Now, let me just say from the beginning, let's understand, they are law enforcement officers. They are considered police officers. Right now, the duties of school resource officers in our schools, they work with our principals, they assist staff in safety issues within our schools, they serve as liaisons between the police agency, our security staff, and any incidents that we may have in the school. The SROs also present a viable presence to serve as positive role models for our students. They create a working relationship between law enforcement staff and the students. Unless there's extenuating circumstances, such as rumors or fights or other serious incidents, the school resource officers patrol the school, they patrol the grounds, they make regular checks, and you know, they have the authority to patrol. They're not like our security officers that are stationary at fixed posts. They control the school grounds. The use of force by SROs will be done in a reasonable manner in accordance with police department use of force general order. So that's what I wanted to mention to you, Delegate Washington. As far as use of force incidents, the school system does not investigate use of force under the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. That's handled by the police department, and they do the investigation through their internal affairs division through regulations that they have in place. We do, when we have any incidents with the SROs, we work with the police department to find out the incident. But at the end of the day, the police department is responsible for investigating the SROs within the school system or any incidents that occur with the SROs. Next slide, please. Again, the SRO's roles and responsibilities with the administration. I'm not going to go over everything, but it's very important that the principals and the staff have a great relationship with the SROs within their schools to make sure that there's proper safety within the schools, to make sure that the students are aware of their responsibilities with SROs, and the SROs are also aware of the responsibilities that the students have concerning discipline and control. Most of the rules and policies we have, the SROs follow it, but they also follow the Prince George's County Police Department or Hyattsville Police Department or Bowie Police Department, standard operating procedures concerning their position. And we have, you know, as part of the MOU, we have an agreement on how we deal with issues within our schools that include the SROs, the principals, and those and all the administrative staff. So right now we have a working relationship with the SROs and the police department, and to make sure that there's a great deal of communication that goes on. Next slide, please. Now, this is important. We talked about personnel with arrest powers. One of the things I wanted to mention, there are 33 SROs with arrest powers that are assigned to our high schools. the Department of Safety and Security has 66 school security staff with arrest powers. School security officers do not carry weapons. The only armed personnel in schools are SROs. So let me just make that clear. The SROs, the 33, have arrest powers, but we also in the school system, that I don't think people understood, that we actually have 66 security personnel that also conduct arrests in the school system. When I get to the numbers about arrests, you will see that a large majority of arrests, and I'm gonna say that out front, a large majority of our arrests are not conducted by the SROs. A large majority of our arrests are conducted by our own security staff that have arrest powers. So right now, the total number of security staff and SROs with arrest powers in our Prince George's County school system are 99. And as far as school security staff, they can only have arrest powers on the property of the school. They cannot go off and do anything else off the property of the school to arrest people. Now, school resource officers can, because obviously they're law enforcement people in addition to SROs. But right now, we have 66, and they went through training. They have 66 security staff that have arrest powers. Next slide, please. Now, the type of charges by the SROs and school security staff, they have charged people with extortion. We have seriously bodily injury, obviously drugs, weapons, fight. We have a lot of fighting sometimes in our schools, in certain schools, attacks on other students. And the big thing is theft and extortion. And I say that because people are stealing cell phones from students, taking their property, taking sneakers. So between extortion, which is really theft, that's not the definition, but that's what's occurring in the schools. They're threatening other students with extortion and theft of their property. And so those are the main top charges that we usually deal with in our school system. Next slide, please. Now, what I wanted to do, and I've got to commend Delegate Washington. He asked for this information. Like I said, I have it for the first 3 years, the last 3 years, and then we've gotten some additional information that he requested last night. But for school year 2019 to 2020, we had 274 arrests. Now understand 2020, because of COVID, the numbers stopped around March. So these numbers only go up until March of 2020. At the high school level, which you're going to have a majority of your arrests for this school year, we had 232 at the high school level, 35 at the middle school, and 7 at the elementary school. The gender makeup, mostly the makeup of arrests is male, and you'll see this throughout the arrests. And there were 90 females that were arrested in this school year. The ethnicity makeup, obviously a large percentage is African American and some Hispanic. And now for the total arrests for this year, which was 274, the SROs doing this year only made 32 arrests. So they only made 32 arrests out of 274, which was about 11.67%. So what I want to say to you is our own security staff are making most of the arrests in our school system. And I'm just telling it like it is. We're making most of the arrests. We're dealing with this. The next slide, please. And when you look at the grade breakdown for arrests, again, most of our arrests have been in the 9th grade and 10th grade. And I went back and looked. This is pretty consistent. For this school year, 46.3% at the 9th grade level were arrested. And then at the 10th grade level, one of the things that Mr. O'Neill and myself and Dr. Goals have been talking about is we got a problem from people going from the 9th grade to the 10th grade. And that's where we have our issues of what do we do about dealing with the 9th graders that have issues, and what do we need to do internally to address the issues of arrest. As far as repeat offenders, student arrested 2 or more times in a year, 13 students were repeat offenders, and 27 arrests are attributed to those 13 students. Next slide, please.
Hey, Mr. Stanton, I want to just give you a 5-minute warning so we can.
Okay, we'll move on. These are just special ed, and again, 18.6% are special ed. Can we go to the next slide, please? And then in school year 2018 to 2019, we had 311 arrests. The same type of numbers show the high school, the males, African Americans are arrested. And then in that school year, SROs arrested 38 people, which is 12.21%. Next slide, please. And again, the 9th grade, 10th grade level are the ones that have most of the arrests right now that we're dealing with. And I just want to show that. Next slide, please. And again, special ed, we had 63 in that school year, which about 20.2% were special ed. And that's just a number that we wanted to pass on. Next slide, please. School year 2017, 2018, we had 350 arrests. Again, the same consistency exists at the high school level, large arrests, males, African Americans. We didn't have the SR arrest data for that year available. We just didn't have it at that point. Next slide, please. And again, the same grade level, 9th grade, 10th grade level is where a majority of our arrests occurred. You see the repeat offenders. So I won't repeat that. You can see the numbers for itself. Next slide, please. Same thing with special ed. You have that. Next slide, please. So then for Prince George's County Public Schools, what's our recommended next steps for us internally? One, we've talked about surveying our students and our parents to allow their voice to be heard about the SROs. One of the things Dr. Golson and myself and Mr. O'Neill talked about, we need to look at reducing the arrest powers of our internal security staff. Obviously, they're arresting a lot more people than we believe they should. I'm not comfortable with that, and I think I know we need to reduce those numbers. We want to create a crisis prevention model in partnership with the Department of Social Services. We want to continue, as I'm sure you've heard from the board, to continue to increase mental health support to our students over the next 3 years. And one thing that I've been working on since I know the state's attorney's office, we've been working on a diversion program this year. Due to COVID, obviously, we don't have any kids in school, but when kids come back to school, I want to finalize implementing the diversion program with the Office of State's Attorney so we can look at, instead of charging students with J1s, we want to be able to divert students to diversion programs so they're not charged, and we can bring our arrest numbers down. So at this point, that's the end of my PowerPoint. Any questions?
No, thank you, Mr. Stanton. Really appreciate it. And I just wanted to take this moment to recognize PGCPS CEO, Dr. Monica Goldson, who's here with us. Dr. Goldson, you want to add a couple words there?
The data speaks for itself, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me and look forward to, I see there are already some questions, so looking forward to hearing the questions.
Yeah, Mrs. Stanton, I just want to thank you for your last comments, which was recognizing that there's a problem with the arrest data. I have not heard that from a school system at all. And so I really do appreciate you saying that and saying that, and even creating some recommendations on, even taking a step and creating some recommendations on reducing those numbers. So I appreciate that. That was
if I could just say one thing, Dr. Golson has said that to me many times also. You might not have heard it from her, you heard it from me tonight, because I'm being honest about it, that we've got too many arrests within our school system and we need to do something about it. But I want to be clear to the task force. The arrests are not occurring by the SROs. These arrests are occurring by our own security personnel that Dr. Golson and I want to address. So I'm going to close and let Dr. Golson speak. I apologize.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I had to add this one point. I know I said I wasn't going to say anything after I just made that last comment, but I own the problem. So, when we looked at the data, we realized that, unfortunately, we would think that it would be when you look at our arrest data around SROs, when really it is us. Now, our investigative counselors are retired police officers, and that is why they have been trained to have that arrest power. And we have already reached out to the Maryland State Department of Education, who oversees this Maryland Safe to Learn Act, and already have had recommendations on ways that we could reduce some of the arrest powers, and are willing to do that. So as you could see over the years, the suspension numbers, those are arrest numbers, but I want you to know suspension numbers also have been declining, because I monitor suspension data every month, and I send principals nice little notes when the numbers are not where I need them to be. So we acknowledge and own it and are willing to begin to make some changes.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that comment. You know, the state hasn't required it. The state only required for us to collect arrest data in the school year 2015 and 2016. So we really don't know the numbers fully beyond that. At least the state doesn't yet. But the numbers in 2015, 2016 was 588 arrests, and the numbers have trickled down a little bit, but it's still. And again, I just want to reiterate how much I appreciate that you guys acknowledge that this is a problem. So thank you for that. And Dr. Ghost and I had multiple conversations about school to prison pipeline and suspension rates at our schools. So let's take the first question, Ms. Tara Jackson.
Thank you. Let me first apologize because I'm going to have to stay off camera today. But thank you, Dr. Golson, as always, for your leadership, and Mr. Stanton. I just have a quick question. In your presentation, you talked about the fact that the principals have the responsibility for discipline within the schools. And so there's been quite a bit of conversation about whether or not arrests are being used as a form of discipline. And so I'd like to know kind of what sort of intersection there is now between the principal and either the security officer or the SRO when an arrest is made. Does the principal authorize it? If you could talk to us a little bit about that relationship there.
Yeah, let me speak to it, having been a former principal. So let me be very honest. Our principals set the tone for their building. And so I can honest and truly say that there probably is an intersection of some principals who have utilized it as a form of handling discipline. Is that the accurate way to do it? Definitely not. Really, our school resource officers were supposed to be placed in our buildings as a way for there to be a bridge between students, the community, for them to really look at police officers differently than probably now we do, to have relationships with them, for them to be part of that school community. And I can say I'm as a principal of 2 former high schools, my SROs were both coaches at both of those schools. So our students looked at them differently. But in addition, I owned my discipline. I didn't turn it over to officers. But were there some places? Definitely. And now that we drill down into our data, that will come to light. So the presentation you saw is the one already shared with our Board of Education, that was already shared with our principals, with a very candid conversation that numbers don't lie, you can't hide. And as much as I'm reducing suspensions, you can't go to this as another alternative to handle student discipline.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to the next question, Ms. Josephine Morning. And if anyone else has a question, please either raise your hand or put it in the chat, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Golson, and thank you, Mr. Stanton, for that report. I have 2 questions. I will be quick, and I bring you these questions from the community, okay? The community seems to think, and I want to know whether this is true, that these SROs are only in certain high schools, and there are certain high schools that do not have the SROs. Is that correct?
No, that is not accurate. All high schools have SROs.
Okay. My second question is this. There seems to be quite a lot of arrests among the special education department kids. And I'm concerned because we know that a lot of times there's a huge number of children with ADD and ADHD. And do they have counselors there at the school that they can actually uh, go to? Because I know years ago that was there in the schools. My son had it, so there were places they could go in the schools when they had issues. Are those things still available in the school?
Yeah, so let me delve into that just a little bit and quickly. When we went and disaggregated our special education data even further, some of our high schools have what we call centers, special education centers, where there are concentrated services for our students. And many times those students that fall in that category are labeled as emotionally disturbed. So unless the person who sometimes a trigger, a word, anything could really create a situation where that person, that student really just gets set off and then go, and it just kind of spirals. In all of those places, there is a crisis intervention specialist, resource person. There's also a professional school counselor. I am grateful through the Kerwin funding, we have now 90 schools that have mental health providers. Now, unfortunately, that's not all of our schools. I have a total of 206 schools. And so we do need to continue to provide those mental health supports. And that is one of the Board of Education's priorities in our budget process for fiscal year 2022, which is the one coming up. So we'll continue to increase the number of mental health providers.
Okay, because it would seem that we would definitely have those, you would have the numbers of the students in each school, and we would see where that need would be greater, right?
Yeah, for sure. We would need to add additional mental health support to those high schools that have those special education centers. Correct.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for those questions.
Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you. Mr. Keith Lockridge.
First of all, let me applaud your taking ownership and wanting to reduce arrests. I think everybody applauds you for that. And it's a challenging situation. We know that. I want to unpack a little bit I think you're saying the SROs do about between 10 and 12% of the arrests in schools. So honestly, my concept of doing an arrest, of who is getting the documentation for arrest, is merely who's signing paperwork. Are you saying that the police in the schools, the SROs, are not involved in 90% of the incidents where someone is arrested? Or are they arrested and just not participating in the paperwork?
No, they are arrested. And like I said, the numbers speak for themselves. 12, like 1 year is 11.6%, they arrested students. 12.2%, I think the number is. But overall, most of the arrests in our school system, which are J1s that go to the state's attorney office, are arrested by our own security staff, not largely by the SROs.
Yeah, no, I got that. What I'm suggesting is that, are you saying that in that 90% that get the J1s, that the police, the SROs are not involved at all in that arrest process?
Yeah,
that's correct.
That is correct.
That is correct. That is correct.
That is correct.
So
and then I want to be clear when we say arrest, because I don't want people to think that every child, that these 200 some kids are going behind bars. They're not.
And they're
they
not.
are charged with the J1 and then released to their parent.
Well, in certain cases, not always, depending on what.
Yeah, but in most cases.
Most cases.
Yep, in most cases.
All right, I find that interesting. It just seems odd that the number of SROs you have at a particular school versus the number of security, it's not 9 or 10 to 1, it's about 3 or 4 to 1, right?
Yeah, and you got to understand, we've got almost 237 security personnel that's assigned to school. Of the 237, 66 have arrest powers. Those 66 float between the schools to use their arrest powers as they are needed. Then you still have the SROs that are assigned to the high schools that provide support. So if for example, one of our school security people that have arrest powers came to an incident, they may not need the SROs to respond. They might have handled the incident based on a review with the principal, the staff, and felt the arrest was appropriate. but there is no difference between the SROs telling our security staff what to do or the security staff telling the SROs what to do or how to arrest.
Essentially, they perform the same function, you're saying?
Pretty much. They both have arrest powers. The only difference is, as I said earlier, our security staff don't carry weapons.
So there's no real difference between the SROs and your security staff?
Other than law enforcement requirements that the police, the SROs can do work outside.
That's what I was going to add. Yeah, the
system.
perimeter.
They are
right,
law enforcement
distance.
personnel. We cannot do that as security personnel. Our power is limited to the property of the school system.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I would just, can I go back to that question to the number of school security personnel? Mrs. Stanton, you said 237.
Yeah, it's approximately that. Yeah, it fluctuates
for the entire school system, and not in the SROs. How many of those 237 are in the actual high schools with arrest powers?
I don't have that particular number on.
Yeah, we could get it to you though. Yeah, because there are another level, there are security assistants that are a lower grade.
That are lower grade, yes.
Right. Okay, yeah, because I think of that number of 237, and I think of us, and I think of Baltimore City, who also has who has a school security force that's actually a police department. And I wonder if with the number of security personnel, as well as with the number of SROs with arrest powers, are we over policing our students? Is that where does the calculus or equation come in? How do you equate that that's accurate and that's a good number of security personnel to oversee?
Yeah, actually, we did chart that out. And so when he gives that number, that's not just high school, that's also over middle schools. And we have double the number of middle schools than we have high schools. And then it's also looking at the number of students in a school. So we have some middle schools that have, maybe 800 students, and then some middle schools that have close to 2,000.
Got it. And
we can provide that chart.
Thank you. I think Ms. Jackson brought up a really good point about principals in relation to SROs. Is there any joint training with principals, administrators, and SROs that occur to make sure that principals are not directing security personnel or SROs to arrest or to make sure they do routine discipline practices within the school?
Yeah, we have, but I have to be honest, that needs to be redone again with the implicit bias lens training that we have been doing systemically. Got it.
And my last question before I go to Mr. Ivy is that I brought up the use of force, and I asked Mr. Stanton about the use of force on students. And the answer that we got today was that those numbers of justified use of force or unjustified use of force is within the Prince George's Police Department. But I would ask that what about the use of force for security personnel, and which is under the school system? But I think it would also be beneficial to the school systems to have that use of force data for the police department, because I think that's critical of an issue, because we're talking about our students here and kids here.
Yeah, I can
go ahead, Barry. I'm after you.
Yeah, I can look at that data and pull that data if we have it. And I'm not really, I've been a few years. I'm learning what data they do track in the security system, in the security department, and some data we weren't tracking. So I'll have Mr. O'Neill pull that data and see what we can find out. But that's a legitimate point.
Yeah, and I was going to say, just to add to that, we can pull that because those employees end up getting referred to employee labor relations for disciplinary action. So we do have a way to find that information.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Ms. Ivy.
Thank you. I had by the way, great presentation. I appreciate it. There was one slide that went past pretty quick, but it was the number of police calls where the police came to a school. And I want to say it was like 300 and something in 1 year. And then you showed the drop the next year. And I guess that was like SROs had been put into the schools or something like that. But I wanted to ask you, if you could put the slide back up, or tell me what it is, and tell me if you can account for what that dramatic change was. What caused?
I think it was a 311 arrest number, Mr. Ivy. That was in school year 2018, 2019, and then it dropped to 2019 to 2020 to 274. But as I said earlier, the 274, because we had COVID from March until the end of the year, we didn't have any arrests.
No, that was a difference. I'm talking about a different slide. This was a slide where I thought it was police being called who were not in the schools, but being called from, regular, I guess 911 calls, and police were showing up at a school, and that was, like 300 or something. And then
It was Beltsville.
No, yeah.
Was
You
it?
showed the one on Beltsville.
Oh, you're talking about the issue of the history of of the history of the SROs. If you can go back, I can tell you what slide that was on. It was on slide 5, the history of the resource officer. And in 1998-99 school year, police responded to Northwestern High School 327 times. And then in 1999-2000 school year, the police, other than the resource officer, responded to the school only 56 times. And this was a reduction of 271 calls for service to the school.
Okay. So, what's the takeaway on that? Is it just that well, I guess I'm kind of curious, because there's some talk about getting officers out of the schools entirely.
Right.
And 1999, that's a long time ago. But what's the sense on, if we do that, if we get law enforcement out of the schools, or maybe even school security, I don't know, but will that lead back to a lot of 911 calls where the police show up?
Well, let me put my public safety hat on, Mr. Ivy. Yes, it will require additional response to all schools, that the high schools where we had the resource officers. So understand, if we don't have resource officers in the school, our staff are still going to call 911. So the response time could be anywhere from 7 to 8 to 9 minutes to respond to that particular call, depending on the circumstances and the police response. So understand, if you don't have a resource officer in the school, and I'm not saying they control everything in the school, but if you don't have the resource officer in the school, then my staff are going to call 911.
And let me answer your question. So you were asking about what happened from 1998 to 1999. 1998 was no SROs in our schools.
Right.
And so we called. 1999 was the first year that we started SROs with Maryland National Park and Planning and the police department. And that is where the reduction came.
Thank you, Dr. Goes.
Mm-hmm.
One last, I'm delegate, I apologize, but one just quick follow-up. What's the sense on, or if there's institutional knowledge, if it's, again, this is so long ago, but what's the sense of how they respond when they show up? Are we talking about, the cops that show up, coming in maybe stronger than an SRO might, or, is there a same kind of reaction? What might that?
Well, from my experience for 2 years in the school system and prior to my previous job, when the SROs in the school are the lead. So when the SROs and the police respond, the first thing the police are going to do with that SRO in the school is to say, what's going on? You gain the information, you evaluate the situation, and hopefully the SRO can give that police officer that's responding information on how to address the situation. So that's what you get with the SROs, but not saying you don't get that with security personnel, but with the relationship between law enforcement and law enforcement, you get a different communication piece on what's going on in the school system.
And I do want to add, I think there is a value add of having someone there who understands the relationship and the role that you play. So if I'm the principal and a kid is going off, in the hallway, and if I say I got it, then that police officer is going to stand back because he's worked with me enough to know I got it. Somebody coming in off of the street who sees this kid going off are going to think, let me go and protect this short woman because I see him going off. So they're going to come in because they've been called to do so. And I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying that I think the context of it and having someone there helps.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the chance. And thank you for the information in the presentation.
Yeah, thank you as well. I'm trying to see if there's any other questions here in the chat. Am I missing anybody?
I just wanted to say thank you, Mr. Stanton. It was very, very enlightening.
Well, nice
Excellent
talking to you.
presentation.
I appreciate it, Judge. Nice talking to you again.
Nice to see you again.
Thank you as well. I just have one follow-up question, or just follow-up question to this. Dr. Golson, I think 237, and this is just coming from me, and looking at our police departments across the county, in addition to the 33 SROs, it sounds like a lot of police officers. Is a lot of security. Is there any movement in reducing the number of security personnel, not only the arrest powers, but just reduce the number of security personnel? SROs are trained. I know that there's also some security personnel that are trained as well. Oh, they have. I'm not sure if they go through the same training, but I think they do.
They do,
according to the state law that I helped write on this. And so I wonder if the school system has a plan in reducing the number of school security personnel.
So let me, golly, I have to be very honest. We have had a very candid conversation about that. And honestly, we will make a decision around that in January. We are, as everyone knows, as we've made it public, in the process of really reassessing where we are with budget. And that's why I was late, because I am in 2 weeks of sitting down with every division and reviewing budgets. But that is a very strong consideration for us around the reduction. Not set in stone. It has not been presented to the Board of Education, but we have had very candid conversations on our side related to that.
Thank you for that candor. Appreciate it. I want to just thank you, Dr. Golson and Mr. Stanton, for being here. I'm sorry, Pastor Robinson, I missed you. My apologies, sir.
No problem. Dr. Golson, good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Mr. Stanton, thank you for that presentation. I think my concern is what about the arrest records with these children? What's going on with the arrest record? Does that follow them into adulthood? You just kind of talk about the idea of qualified immunity with police officers. Well, young people have some immunity with age. Some of this stuff, they know they can't get in trouble. They know that they are kind of protected. So it allows them to act out a little bit. But the concern that I have is, do these arrest records follow them? I mean, the whole idea of getting these kids scarred for life for some behavior problem that they're dealing with in school. Now, you've got the internal forces. There are people who want to come into our schools and hurt our children, and they should be protected. But internally, you have behavior problems. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself will bring his mother to shame. So, in terms of correction, there's something has to be done. We seem to be polarized, looking too much like Democrats and Republicans at this point, wanting kids in school or out of school. But the issue is, how do we resolve this behavior problem? And do we have to put a spot on the record of our children at such a young age? And that's where my concern is.
So I'm going to say a little bit there, Barry. I know you want to jump in. Pastor Robinson, thank you so much for that. I want to say, before this ever came to be, we started a process last year of creating this relationship with the state's attorney's office and created a diversion program with a really large with many partners, one of them being Reed Temple, AME Church, and CPAC, and the several other groups. And honest and truly, when those students get a J1, is to hold it, not process it, allow them to go through a process of getting support, counseling, some community service hours completed that will help towards graduation, and assigning a mental health provider to really give them support. Barry has done a phenomenal job carrying through with that MOU. And then COVID happened. And so we weren't able to begin the process of the pilot of utilizing a few schools. We were going to use the schools with our highest suspension rate. highest arrest rate to use as a pilot, and then COVID came. And that is why he made the comment that when school reopens, we will use that diversion program. And so we too agree. What I don't want to do is create a situation where my children, when they leave, don't have an opportunity for success. And I want to create every opportunity I can. And I do acknowledge that sometimes they do fall into discipline problems, and the support is not always at home that they need in order to correct that behavior. And the fact that I have some outside supporting agencies who are willing to offer that is a blessing. And I plan to utilize those strategies to help to do that. So that if they do follow through with the community service, the counseling, and just going to one of those partners, then that J1 is immediately torn up and not processed. Mr. Stanton, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, let me just thank Dr. Golson for really pushing the diversion program. We have met with the attorney's office, the state's attorney. I met with her myself. And at the end of the day, their goal now, moving forward, as we move with this program, is to not have that arrest be on that student's record. The J1 should go away. They go through diversion. If they go through diversion, then that charge would no longer, that J1, I would say charge, but that J1 won't exist. Now, I can be honest with you, they've been doing some of that. We haven't been communicated from the state's attorney previously about how they've been handling J1s and diversion. I just had a meeting today to make sure that occurs and that we have documentation that that J1 is no longer going to be on that person's record.
Okay.
Thank you for that question, Pastor.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Any closing remarks, Dr. Golson or Mr. Stanton?
No, I just want to, I can't speak, but I just want to thank you for inviting me here today, at least sharing the information since we've been in school. I mean, this is my second year and I've learned a lot from Dr. Golson, and her heart is really tied to the students and trying to divert the arrest numbers and trying to make sure our kids get what they need. So thank you very much for allowing me to comment.
And I too want to say thank you. Thank you for allowing me to enter late. That is not my regular way that I function. Once again, I've been in the throes of budget and was finishing with academics. And I too just want to say thank you for receiving the data. We make decisions based on data, and sometimes it might not be what I really want to do, but when my data says one thing, then I have to do something to address it. And when we looked at this and realized that the issue falls with me, the buck stops with me, please know that I plan to do something to address it.
No, we appreciate that. And thank you for not using the line of the numbers are decreasing, so everything's okay. So we appreciate that. Thank you very much. Not seeing any other questions here. Dr. Golson, thank you very much. Mr.
Thank
Stanton.
you.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon.
Judge Lamazny.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. To the members of the work group, we have a few minutes before our next presenter. I wanted to know if there's any thoughts that anyone wants to share on this topic particularly, or we can take a 10-minute break. It's totally up to you guys, right?
We always want a break, Mr. Chair.
I vote for the break.
I vote for the break.
Me too.
All right, so you all are being recorded and it's live, so. Okay, so
that was Wanika Fisher who said that, yes, to the public. I did say that.
So let's take a quick 10-minute break. Let's keep it recording, Ryan, and we'll come back at exactly 5:10 to begin. That work?
That works.
Okay.
That's
you.
great. Thank you. I'm not gonna leave. I'm just gonna.
just a quick warning, everybody. We're going to start in about 3 minutes just to give some time back. Commissioner, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
See you.
Yep, we'll get started. So I just wanted to just greet you and say hello.
Yes, sir. No
And
problem.
I wanted to thank Miss Michelle as well.
It's my pleasure to help.
Commissioner, I'm not sure if you met our co-chair, Judge Lamasny.
No, we haven't met. Nice to meet you, sir.
Pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you. It's very nice of you to do this for us.
My pleasure. Seems like I've been glued to the Zoom all day, every day.
I know.
I'm sure you feel the same thing.
Well, we do Zoom, we do Teams, and Tuesday, for the first time, I did GoToMeeting, which I'd never done before. So it's like every day's an adventure.
They're all the same to me now. Just, I'll be glad to be back in person, to meet in person
Right.
when it's safe and healthy, you know.
Commissioner, I'm Kevin Hughes. I'm the acting deputy chief for Prince George's County. I grew up in Baltimore City.
So you know what kind of you know what kind of fire hose I'm drinking from.
Yes, sir.
My apologies, Major, for not introducing you. My apologies.
Oh, that's okay.
Steve Harrison, why is this the second Zoom I've been on with you today?
Sorry?
I said, why is this the second Zoom I've been on with you in one day?
I'm going to claim you on my taxes.
All right, guys, we're gonna get started. It's 5:10 now. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. We wanted to give everybody an opportunity to take a break. We typically don't start at 4 p.m., but we wanted to stay some time for Dr. Golson and PGCPS and Barry Stanton to conduct a presentation in front of us. Our next presenter that we have in front of us is a famous guy across the nation. He's been doing Zooms for a very long time, a lot in this time, and I even saw him on one today with the Black Caucus of Maryland. And I'm happy to introduce the Commissioner, Michael Harrison of the Baltimore City Police. And this gentleman has a lot of experience, and he's worked in New Orleans. Hopefully I'm saying that right, New Orleans.
Yeah, you can't mess it up.
I know, right?
You can say it so many ways. You're doing great.
And he's overseeing 2 consent decrees, and we're just happy to have him and wanted to hear from some of his thoughts, some of his feedback on policing in general and what he's done in his history of policing. So, Commissioner, thank you for being here on behalf of the commission and our county. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you all. For some of you who heard me say a few things earlier, bear with me. Some of it may be familiar if you've heard me talk to the Black Caucus earlier today. But as you said, this is my second city as a police chief in New Orleans. Like Baltimore, struggled with violent crime. At one time, New Orleans had the highest murder rate in the country for a number of years per capita. And so it struggled with violent crime, but it also struggled with a lot of broken pieces within the police department. And in 2012, the DOJ conducted an investigation, much like they did here in Baltimore, and called the New Orleans Police Department the most, and this is a quote, the most troubled police department in America. And then I later went on to become the chief in 2014. the 1 year into that consent decree. And then fast forward, I came to Baltimore last year, 1 year into Baltimore's consent decree. Much like New Orleans, the city had a number of broken issues in the police department and a culture of violent crime. And those two are not mutually exclusive. So I'm here to really tackle both of those. And I think I may be the only chief, I've tried to do some research to take on two cities under a federal consent decree. Some have done one, some have done variations of a consent decree, but not two full federal consent decrees. I recently did some work, and I'll get to the consent decree in a minute. I was selected to join the U.S. Conference of Mayors earlier this year, along with two other chiefs from Phoenix and Columbia, South Carolina, to join 3 mayors out of Chicago, Cincinnati, and Tampa to be in a working group to create recommendations for the nation and for the 1,400 cities in that organization on what reform should be and social justice and police reform should be. We can send that to you so you can take a look at that. It mirrors a lot of what's in the Baltimore and the New Orleans consent decree, but it's national best practices and recommendations for cities and departments when we reimagine what policing should be from a policy perspective, from a cultural perspective. And I'm about to take on another initiative. I was just invited to join the National Police Foundation, who wants to put out recommendations in a report by January 1st for the country on what police reform should be for the country and what all 50 states should be looking at. And so I'll be joining that and doing work with them starting next week. That's just a little background. I am certainly in favor of reform, but it goes hand in hand with public safety and all of the things that we're working with Maryland chiefs and sheriffs. I'm on that working group to talk about what reform looks like and how we can bring about reform in our own agencies and jurisdictions and bringing that to the legislature. And that's ongoing as we speak. So talking about the Baltimore consent decree, we're forging ahead with everything in the consent decree, 18 core items, all really talk about building trust in the community, how we restore trust, how we have police legitimacy. Number one, we recently rewrote about a dozen use of force related policies, already banning chokeholds, emphasizing de-escalation, the duty to intervene, not just as a duty, but as a requirement, and then we have a policy and as a culture. And then we went and elevated what in the law talks about reasonableness or objective reasonableness to reasonable and necessary. Force should, when we use force, it should not just be reasonable, but necessary. Now, there's some people who disagree with that and should think we should only be following what the Constitution and the law states, which is reasonable, what a reasonable person would do, but it has to be necessary as well. So the Baltimore policy is kind of elevated against all the other policies and what the law actually requires. But it has to be documented and intensely reviewed. These policies only implemented after we went through a robust training program designed with the adult learning model with scenario-based training. All of that was done to implement these policies. We did that last year. We've completed it with all 2,500 sworn members of the department, and now we're into the next phase. But it does have a duty to intervene built into the policy. It's not just a requirement, like I said, but we want to make the culture of the department. That's why I'm bringing to Baltimore a program you should look at. It's called EPIC, or Ethical Policing is Courageous. It's a peer intervention program that we created in New Orleans based on active bystandership research. It's a robust training program helping officers understand how to intervene, when to intervene, and how and when to allow an intervention to be done on them, regardless of rank. And it teaches officers the science behind it, but it teaches you practical application practices on how to intervene, even on people of higher rank. But it has to be coupled, get this chief, with a good anti-retaliation policy so that you can actually protect those officers who step forward and do the right thing against those who are escalating. Now, it doesn't mean that an officer has done the wrong thing, but when we see an officer escalating behavior and on a path to making a bad decision is when we want officers to step in and intervene And it's a promise officers make to each other and to the agency that they would do that and they would allow it to be done on them. So it prevents mistakes, it saves lives, it saves injuries, and it saves officers' careers. So we're bringing that here. You can look at the EPIC program in New Orleans, or you can look at the ABLE project, which is out of Georgetown Law, which has elevated the EPIC program and its active bystandership for law enforcement. And it's going to be a national program, right there in your backyard at Georgetown University, to teach departments from around the country how to do this. Number 3 in our policy, we have police involvement in behavioral health crisis. And we spent a lot of time in our consent decree. And this was long before we started talking about police should not be involved in dealing with mental health, but creating crisis intervention training that teaches officers how and when to deal with those dealing with mental illness and those kinds of calls that we're being dispatched to. Our Baltimore monitoring team has kind of praised us for the creation of the training and beginning that training and how we're thinking about how and when to handle those kinds of calls. Certainly we are in favor of healthcare experts handling those calls, because many times we're not the appropriate people, but when those times happen, perhaps when people are armed and it requires police intervention, how to do that from a behavioral health perspective and a holistic approach dealing with those interactions with people suffering from mental illness. So much more work needs to be done, but it's those collaborative partnerships that help gain community trust and improve our interactions with individuals who need help and assistance, not necessarily an arrest or time in a jail cell. That's absolutely the wrong thing and the thing we don't want to do. And so we're teaching officers how, through crisis intervention training, how to really slow down and really deal with this from a mental health perspective. Number 4, stop, searches, and arrests, which I think, along with use of force, are the 2 main core items that put Baltimore and New Orleans in a consent decree. Stops, searches, and arrests often represent the most frequent type of interactions we in law enforcement have with the public. It's crucial that these activities be done within the parameters of policy and the Constitution and are conducted using procedural justice principles and then fully documented so that it can be transparent, not just internally with the department, but externally to the community. We rewrote all of our policies related to how we stop and search individuals to emphasize that we absolutely have to do proactive policing, which is still a very necessary part of our job, but that the response should be effective and least intrusive when possible. As with use of force, we're now training all of our officers in the new policies on stop, searches, and arrests so we can understand and have the ability to properly act on them. This training has received a lot of accolades from the members of the department who are now saying, I didn't know I couldn't do that. And I didn't know I should have done it this way. And we have so many members of our department who, as a culture now, fundamentally believe they could just go out and conduct stops in a very arbitrary way without any justification. And though they were trained in the correct way, according to Fourth Amendment, they're now being retrained and are saying this is, instead of telling them what they can't do, we're teaching them what they can do and backing it up with law, with the Constitution, and with best practices. And so it's actually getting a lot of praise from the officers, and it's building their confidence, because when we started the consent decree, the thing you'll learn with consent decrees is officers, it's either all or nothing. When they're told that we're under a consent decree, they just shut down until you can teach them what it is you can do, because the consent decree has all these modified policies that tell you what you've done wrong and what you should now do right. And officers walk away thinking, well, we've been doing this wrong, let's just not do it at all and not do anything, which then turns into a crime fighting disparity, and we can't really fight crime the way we're supposed to and protect people. And so now we're teaching them about what they can do, not just teaching them about what they shouldn't do and can't do. And then 5, community policing. Certainly, Chief, this is the cornerstone of any law enforcement agency. And we're working hard to ensure that every officer understands what community policing is, what it isn't, and how to implement it. We recently created our first ever community policing plan. Now, we've had community policing policies, we've had all types of things, but there's never been a comprehensive plan on what community policing is and how to fully implement it and integrate it into a department and turn the department into a community-centric and community-minded agency. It's on our website. Please go take a look at it. You can download it and look at it and use any part of it. But it specifically identifies actionable tasks that members of all the ranks and assignments can do to ensure community policing is properly applied. And it's based on the fundamental principle that every member of the agency is a community policing officer. And it does away with the concept that 3 or 5 or 10 officers in every district are responsible for community policing. Rather, everybody is actually responsible for it. It's in training development with significant input from the community. That's underway, and we'll soon be able to give our officers the tools to go out and fully implement it and put it into practice. And then, last but not least, this is a big thing. You may be much further ahead than we are here. We're just unveiling a new records management system that will take us out of a paper environment into a digital environment. We're still handwriting reports, and this is about 25 years overdue. It's going to make us totally digital. We'll be replacing, like I said, those handwritten reports, those handwritten interview cards, handwritten pay slips, and all of the requests and paper documents that we have to fill out for officers to just make simple requests are going to be digitized and put into a records management system. Then we'll build a case management system for investigators. Those reports will be able to be done straight from the police car, from the mobile data terminal inside the police car. Many departments are already there, have been there for many years. We're just now getting there, but that's a huge technological advance. And that acquisition will give us the ability to create a digital dashboard, both inward facing and outward facing to the community, so we can be transparent. Here's the thing about accountability. I lead with what's called accountability driven leadership, and accountability without transparency is not accountability at all. When I talk about accountability and now making my team talk about accountability, it's not whether we do a thing well, but rather how many people know we do a thing well. Because if we do something well and no one knows it, do we really do it well? And so it's about making sure people know that if we say we've done something well, or we've made an improvement, or we took a corrective action on something that wasn't done well, being transparent and communicating that internally and externally is how we really validate our accountability, through transparency. And so you've heard me talk about de-escalation, a duty to intervene. By the way, you have to have not just a de-escalation policy. I think every agency has to take on a de-escalation model. We use the ICAT model, called ICAT, Integrating Communications, Assessments, and Tactics. It's a PERF created model that we've identified. It's a couple of years old in this department. A number of departments around the country use that model, but selecting a model and then integrating the entire model into the department so your policy is backed up by a model, which is a best practice, I think is the way to go. And then certainly body-worn cameras. We've had them for a number of years. And there's certainly the catalyst that changes officer behavior and changes citizen behavior. And with proper auditing and proper management of a body cam program, you can create a better reward system. You can create a better discipline system because it's the thing that really allows you to have that accountability and transparency. But you have to purchase the hardware, the licenses, and have the ability to go in and do audits. And then an early warning system, which we're building a combination of an early warning / early intervention system, which would digitize all of our documents within our department and allow officers to do the entire performance evaluation digitally. And every observation the supervisor would make, they can do a digital upload. So annually, you can go into this computer module and pull up everything a supervisor would have made an input in, instead of going to a file cabinet and trying to pull out notes from a year ago to complete a performance evaluation. Then there's civilian oversight. We have probably more civilian oversight here than most countries, especially with this consent decree. But then civilian oversight on trial boards and civilian on trial boards. Baltimore was the first in the state to agree to that model and that concept and implement it. And we're just about to get started with our first trial board in the very near future with civilians, 2 civilians on a 5-person trial board. And it's a recommendation that the chiefs and sheriffs of Maryland are making to the legislative body about adding civilians to the trial board. but we're very close to our very first trial board with civilians. And then certainly I'm in favor of, and I think all the chiefs and sheriffs are now in favor of, officers who are convicted of a misdemeanor do not qualify for a trial board, because we want to put the authority and autonomy to discipline back into the hands of the executive, the chief or sheriff. And too many things either in LEOBR or in collective bargaining have taken away management rights from the executive. But we want to make sure that we have the full authority and autonomy to discipline the folks who step across the line and commit criminal acts, and step across the line and commit administrative infractions. But we need to have that authority and autonomy and not bargain that away to the labor organizations who can dictate that. So that's a little bit about our consent decree. It really is all, when you put it all together, it's a blueprint for how we improve our processes. And it is not directly tied to crime reduction, but it is indirectly tied to it, because through those process improvements, it makes the organization have systems of accountability, both human systems and technological systems of accountability that prevents bad acts and informs us when they do happen, so we can have the appropriate response. And then you tag on strong transparency with that accountability. It helps foster community trust. But in that consent decree, it's all citizen and resident driven. The community had great input and still has great input and has representation on this monitoring team. And we have a local person from Baltimore who's in charge of everything community on our monitoring team, and can report out to the judge at any time. And that is working for us. In the beginning, of course, you get pushback from the unions and from the officers. We're 3 years into it now, and we are 3 years into what America is now demanding of the rest of its police departments. And so we have some benefit, and some of our policies are actually now being shared with others around the country. And though we have a long way to go, and obviously, we were a department in distress, we're now being viewed as a department who's pulling itself up out of that distress. Though we still have a long way to go, we're being recognized for at least the beginning of the reforms that are being made. I think I want to let you all ask some questions. I've been talking for a few minutes. I want to open it up for you, and I'm going to take a sip of water, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
No, thank you, Commissioner. We really appreciate that. And we appreciate the 20 minutes of you talking. It was a great information, I thought, of the 7, I think there's 7 or 8 pillars that you mentioned. So thank you for that. Let's go to our first question, Judge Lemassney.
Thank you very much, sir. That was an excellent presentation. Do you have a policy concerning stopping vehicles for minor motor vehicle, like a taillight out, and then trying to get a consent search or go from there? Is there a policy?
Yes, and so I don't know that there's a policy prohibiting stops for minor infractions. However, we're about halfway through training all of our officers in stops, searches, and arrests. And in that training, we're going over Fourth Amendment and making sure people are clear on when they can make stops and why they should make stops, and actually how to use those precursor stops. And I think that's what you're talking about.
The pretextual stops, yeah.
Yeah, that lead to probable cause, and they use that for to gain probable cause to find something bigger and better. Yeah, and so we're talking about that and prohibiting that, and even not just vehicle stops, but officers were using pedestrian stops the same way. And there was a concept in Baltimore called clearing corners. They also would get out and just make everybody move or arrest anybody who didn't move. And people were not actually committing a crime, but rather just standing on the sidewalk. Though it might be a nuisance, it was not justifiable to do that or arrest them when they didn't move. And so we go over all of that in the stop, search, and arrest training, but we talk about and connect it to how harmful to the community is when we do that, and how harmful it is to our reputation when those cases are not accepted by the state's attorney's office. And then we complain about, we stop people and arrest people and they're back out on the street. But that's part of why we got into a consent decree. Because many times the officer was not able to articulate that it really was a broken tail light, or it really was a traffic violation that was the pretext stop, but rather it was fabricated by the officer, or we couldn't prove it anyway, even if it was true. And so it's discouraged, but it is part of the new training we have. And if we have a policy prohibiting it, I will look at that and get that back to you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you as well. Next question, Delegate Juanita Fisher. You there?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay. Hi, Chief Harrison. Thank you so much. I have a bit of like a technical and a comparison question for you. For the Baltimore City Department, what are the stages of discipline for officers that turn their cameras off? And is there their body or their dash? And does it like, how is the infraction taken? Then how does the infraction escalate if they're caught doing that more than one time?
So while I don't have the specific punishment as it escalates, what I can tell you is there is discipline for officers who, number one, don't turn the camera on and they're going to a call. There is discipline for those who turn it off prematurely. But it has to be that we know they didn't turn it on. For example, one officer, you saw that he observed something, he jumped out the car really quickly. He attempted to turn it on, but it didn't turn on. There was a chase. I think when he realized it wasn't on, he turned it on. That was an inadvertent miss. And so there is, it's a minor infraction for not turning it on. However, when there is use of force and the use of force turns out to be unjustified, the punishment is escalated. And there are recommendations going into the next legislative session to think about how severe we want that discipline to be. If when a use of force is done on a citizen, and then when it is unjustified or unnecessary or unreasonable, and the officer did not turn the camera on, but had a camera, did not turn it on. So we have an escalation of discipline, and I can get that to you specifically.
Yeah, if you could, I think that would help in my subcommittee work. And I think something that I struggle with is it okay that I'm talking, Mr. Chair? Okay, something I struggle with in the work we're doing here at the county level, and even the work I continue to do at the state level, is, getting statements from officers, and that can be used either criminally or civilly when an incident happens, creating a culture of responsibility. And then, an officer who didn't put their camera on may not have known that this is going to end up being a use of force situation, right? It could have started like, at this point and that point, and then like the excuses that you hear, like my camera wasn't working, or it was defective, or and then it's like, if we don't invest in a good system so that that's not given as a reason, those are kind of like the things that keep going. They keep circling in my mind, but I haven't found exact clarity on how to help facilitate our local police department here in Prince George's to have a culture that cameras are on, that punishment will be received, and also to support our officers financially in a system and a camera mechanism that works for them and that's reliable. So those are kind of the things that I'm mentally contemplating, and was looking to see what Baltimore City has done to sort of fill those holes.
Well, we're looking to because we're in the process of revamping our disciplinary matrix. And we're doing that now because we had to do that in New Orleans. But let me share this with you. New Orleans, we put our we went up with the full implementation in April of 14. And what we did was, because we were in the consent decree, we were mandated to give a 1-day suspension for every officer who did not turn the camera on. But there's an unintended consequence for that. And then it was a 3-day suspension if you got caught a second time, a 5-day suspension, a 5 to 10-day suspension a third time. And so what happened was, the unintended consequence was, as a learning curve for a new technology, many officers just were forgetting to do it or inadvertently do it as they jump out the car real fast to chase somebody. If you had a sustained complaint within a year, you were disqualified from promotion for 2 years. Well, we disqualified 800 officers from promotion because we had 800 officers sustained for not having a camera on. Every single body made that mistake at least twice in the first year. And with 800 patrol officers, almost 800 had more than one sustained complaint for that and disqualified all of them for promotion. So we had to rethink that. What we agreed with the Department of Justice on is the officers would get 4 inadvertent misses in a year's time, 365 days.
Mm-hmm.
It goes to an investigation at Internal Affairs. If it was intentional that they left it off, they get punished. They get the discipline remains 1 day or 3 days or 5 days. If it was inadvertent, like they were, a suspect grabbed the officer and there was a struggle and the officer couldn't turn it on, that's inadvertent. Or if the officer was chasing somebody and jumped out the car. So those inadvertent misses, when investigated and we proved that they were inadvertent, the officer got 4 of those a year, and on the 5th one you get disciplined. And it recycles the next year. And when we proved that it was not inadvertent but intentional, then we had strong discipline for it. And when there was a use of force and the officer intentionally did not turn it on, I think it was up to termination. When we had like deadly force or deadly use of force, the punishment went all the way up to termination. Now, that really set the culture, and the officers began to use it. But we had to look at, and you should look at the unintended consequences of over disciplining for officers inadvertently not doing it. And that's the mistake we learned early on. And then we had to go back to the DOJ and kind of back up on how hard we were being with that.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Delegate Fisher.
Thank you.
Yep, we're gonna go to Ms. Crystal Oriata for a question, and we have one more question after that, Mr. Commissioner.
Yes.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. One thing for us as we move into really rolling out our body camera system, and you mentioned the audits that you guys have, what that looks like. Is that annual? Is that done internally? Is it done by like an external unit?
So we have an agency our size, I think an agency your size should have an internal unit or some compliance team that handles audits. And so in the New Orleans policy, I think we have it here, every use of force requires a body camera review. That's every use of force requires a body camera review. But then we don't do this in Baltimore, but we did it in New Orleans. Every supervisor has to do a number of random reviews every day, or a certain amount per week, or on every shift, that is. But for every arrest and for every use of force, whether it's an arrest or not an arrest, there should be a body camera review. And then that's just by the supervisor inside of a district or division. And then if there is some inspections unit or compliance unit within the agency, some type of audit, whether it's monthly or biweekly or quarterly, as an agency should be auditing those. And then we have what's called a performance review board. So when we have a major use of force, I have a team of people who look at that. And before I came on, they were looking at a use of force like a police-involved shooting. A year later, they were assessing it to figure out what mistakes were made, what policy infractions were made, what best practices applied. That's too far because 10,000 more mistakes can happen before you actually review it. So we've narrowed that down, and that has to be done within 30 days now. And so the compliance unit and my body camera unit are looking at every arrest and every use of force, very early on, because they have to prepare a report for the performance review board, which is a monthly meeting. And we go over those, taser incidents, car chases, police-involved shootings, all of those we use to look for tactics and techniques, policies that were broken, best practices. And so everyone, and the reason is everyone may have followed the policy and we still could have had some bad outcome some awful thing that really looked bad, and it came across the media as bad, even though everybody followed the policy. And we have to kind of quarterback that thing and look at that, like a replay of a sport. You put it in replay and look at it all over again and assess it, and then make recommendations for training and discipline, and or discipline, whatever applies. But I think that size agency should have people set aside in a compliance team for a body-worn program to do auditing. But when requests come in to release footage, you have to have people to pull that footage and to black out faces and do all of that and get it ready to prepare to release to the media. It is manpower intensive, and you have to have people in the agency assigned to do that work.
And another question, you mentioned about early warning systems, and earlier on in our work group, we had a presentation around the early warning system that our county is implementing that's really focused on complaints by civilians, and the consequences are more like talking to your supervisor or review. I'm just curious if with your early warning system, is it tied to more than just complaints filed by the citizens? And are there stricter like punishments or consequences that are tied to your early warning system? Because I think one of the things that we're trying to figure out is how to also weed out bad officers early. And so any feedback you can have with your experience on that, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, I want to get you what we have, because in New Orleans, we're doing here what we did in New Orleans, and both consent decrees are pretty similar when it comes to that. It's actually an early intervention system.
Mm-hmm.
So you probably already have some measure of early warning, but this is early intervention, which is a total digital HR system, not a punitive internal affairs system. And so everything a supervisor does, because we're still in a paper environment, we go into this early intervention, and everything a supervisor does or the employee would do would be through this early intervention system. So if an officer is late for work 5 times, or if his uniform is bad, or if it's discourteous to a resident, or breaks other infractions, and then you can begin to see the supervisory inputs into that and create an intervention. So that the intervention comes before the officer gets to a point where discipline is now necessary. And so it's just replacing the paper-driven model where we do counseling sessions and then we type out these things and make them sign it and we put it in a file cabinet. It's really a holistic HR system that can be used with discipline, but we're using it like as an HR. Am I saying that right, Michelle? So it's an HR function, not necessarily an internal affairs function. But the goal is for supervisors to make interventions and referrals before behavior turns to where discipline is needed. When discipline is needed, we do that too. But this is to try to catch it before discipline is needed.
Thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate that answer. We have 2 more questions from Ms. Gutierrez, and I'm just going to mail my questions to you, sir, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I'll send it to Ms. Michelle.
Okay.
Ms. Gutierrez, with just 1 or 2 questions, and we have 3 more presenters, everybody. 3.
Great. I'll try to move this as quickly as possible. So the first question is around transparency and general orders. Does Baltimore City publish their general orders for the public to view?
Yeah, you can go on online and see our policies. It's on our website. Yes, ma'am.
Great. And then the other is when you took on this role, I'm interested in how you approached auditing what was going on. So you had this consent decree that you were dealing with, and how did you familiarize yourself with what was needed in Baltimore City in order to implement some of the approaches that you've shared with us tonight?
Well, that's a very good question. There were 2 things I needed to know. I needed to know who I had and who I needed, what I had and what I needed. And so I took I got hired on February 11th, but I didn't get confirmed until March 12th. So the first 30 days, I was really, integrating and meeting with the members of the department and meeting with the people in the community. But then I created interviews of everybody on my command staff. and then did a deep dive assessment of the entire department, especially the command staff. And what I learned was we had 3 different community policing teams that were in 3 different bureaus and not communicating and talking to one another. We had 3 different auditing teams, and it was really the span of control and was out of whack. The chain of command was out of whack. We had too many people who didn't have any subordinates but had high-ranking positions. So we took the time to go through that and restructure the organization so that the ranks were commensurate with the responsibility. And people had the right amount of people under their supervision. We had one colonel with 1,400 subordinates, and one colonel had 3, but they made the same amount of money, had the same rank, and had different levels of responsibility. We had to condense it, and we made it smaller, but we did a deep dive assessment of how the department was structured, who was doing what, and then how to best align those functions with the people who had the right skill sets. And then we made a lot of realignments so that my auditing was in a compliance and inspections unit and not in patrol. And we moved a few things around, but it really was disjointed, and it took a while to do that, but it meant interviewing every captain, major, lieutenant colonel, and all of our deputy, I had 2 deputy commissioners, and making sure that I had the right people who had the will and competence and temperament in the right positions. And then we realigned so that there was a good flow in the organizational chart.
Great. And just a quick follow-up, how often would you recommend a department engage in this type of assessment? I feel like it would be common for a new commissioner to come in and do that, or a chief of police to come in and do that. But I assume if someone's in that position for 10 years, for example, maybe this type of assessment is needed on a regular basis. What would you recommend?
Well, I recommend what I needed. I don't know what you would need. I tell you what I needed is a staffing study. And although I'm good with those things, the credibility really comes in when you hire a consultant to come in and do that. And so although I did all of those interviews, we interviewed 65 people, and we gave everybody 45 minutes. So it took a while. We were here till 10 o'clock at night, 6-7 nights a week until we got it done. Then we restructured, but we hired a consultant to come in and do a staffing study and a staffing plan. That plan is online on our website. You can take a look at it. And the staffing plan and study looks at how the department was structured and the goals and objectives we set for the organization. We gave the consultant and saying, we need you to tell us how to best structure our organization so that we can accomplish these goals we gave you. Obviously crime reduction, but response times, case per detective ratio and homicide, sex crimes, robbery, how many cases should detectives have, which dictates how many detectives you should have, how much free time on the hour you want each officer to have for community policing, how much occupied time. And then, because you have to have free time to do community policing, but then you have to factor in relief variables on officer off days. That gives you, when you factor all of that in, the amount of calls you're going on, the time you spend on each call, the distance traveled to and from calls. When you factor in the 100 variables, you then can arrive at what's the appropriate number you should have in your sworn ranks. Well, this department had been guessing at what the number should be for so many years. There was never a scientific approach as to how large or how small the agency should be, because that number was being guessed based on geography and size of the city and not on workload analysis. And so we hired a professional consultant to do that for us. Though I changed the structure of the command staff on my own, the staffing plan tells me how to arrive at the appropriate staffing number to accomplish the agency's goals.
And Chief,
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would recommend doing that the first time.
Got it. Great. And we're going to have a new chief soon, so I'm sure that would be a great recommendation
Yes.
from this work group. And Commissioner, I want to just thank you for your time, and Ms. Michelle, thank you also for getting this together. And I got to thank my good friend Senator McCray for connecting us. So I want to thank him as well.
Also, it's McCray that owes me the steak dinner. Okay.
Yeah, and you can throw in Brandon in there too if you want to. I reached out to him as well, the new mayor.
I start at 16 ounces, so okay.
I'll leave you with this question, and maybe you can get an answer for me. What kind of grapple with this, which is what quantitative and qualitative metrics are used to determine an excellent, successful police department and police officer?
That's an easy one. Number one, crime reduction is going to be number one, but then crime reduction backed up by audits to make sure that the officers are actually, that nobody's fudging the numbers. So crime reduction is number one, but the decrease in citizen complaints, along with decrease in rank initiated complaints, measured against the increase of citizen satisfaction surveys. So when you look at reduction in crime, reduction in complaints, reduction in litigation and lawsuits, measured against increase in citizen satisfaction. And so you got to start off with the citizen satisfaction survey. And I can forward you the one that we use in New Orleans. When you look at all the questions asked of residents of how they feel about police interactions, and Baltimore has one too, the consent decree has one. And all the questions about their interaction in the field, at a police station, the way police deal with drug enforcement, gun enforcement, violent crime, and then measure that maybe every 6 months against the department's ability to prevent crime and reduce crime, minimize and then reduce citizen complaints and uses of force that turn into complaints and litigation versus citizen satisfaction, and then you can even include internal officer morale. When you see citizen satisfaction and morale going up, uses of force, lawsuits, and complaints going down, and then crime going down, that's a well-oiled machine, and that's the sign that an agency is on the right track. It'll go up and down in different ways, and some areas will be up, the other areas will be down, and 6 months later it'll flip-flop. But over the first year, the second year, and third year, when you start to see the downward trajectory of crime and complaints and the increase in morale and citizen satisfaction, and then in our case, consent decree compliance, when the DOJ says, yes, this year they did much better with compliance in the consent decree, then you can start to see the trajectory of how you view your organization.
Thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate it. And Ms. Michelle, thank you as well. I look forward to I'm sure I'm gonna see you at Latin Annapolis next year during our legislative session. So it's great talking to you. And thank you.
Delegate, before I hop off, I just want to let you know I'm gonna hit send on an email. I'm responding to an email from Lieutenant Harvin. So there's a couple of you on there. There's 10 different items with links for policies, reports, things that we've talked about tonight. If there's anything else you need, any of you can feel free to reach out to me and I can help you find what you need. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, Senator McCray owes you that check, man. Owes you that steak. I swear, he owes you that steak. That's awesome. Thank you, Ms. Michelle. I appreciate that.
All right, well, I'm gonna add a half gallon of Crown Royal to that. Thank y'all. Take care.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. We're gonna move on to our next presenter. We have Miss Gloria Brown Burnett, the Director of Department of Human Services, who will be conducting a presentation in front of us for approximately 10 minutes, Ms. Brown.
Woo!
10 to 15 if you could. And then we'll take questions from the audience. And thanks for being here, and it's always good to see you.
Fantastic, thank you. So, okay, great. Fantastic. All right, so thank you all for giving me the opportunity to share with you some of the work that we are doing over at the Department of Social Services in support of children and families. The Department of Social Services is the county's lead human services provider. And we strongly believe that resourced families are more likely to be stable and strong families make communities strong. Next slide, please. I'm not going to read you the slides. I kind of just gave you an overview of what our mission is. Our vision for the department is that we lead not only in the county, but the state and the nation in innovation and programs and services that improve outcomes for our citizens. Next slide, please. Today, I'm going to tell you about, for the purposes of your conversation, next slide. For the purposes of this conversation, I want to share information on several of our over 50 programs and services in the areas of prevention, child protective services, foster care and adoption, youth homelessness, and eligibility services. Next slide, please. See, I'm going fast, I'm moving. On the prevention side, one of the strategies that we use is a new office that we recently created, the Office of Strategic Partnerships and Community Solutions, which formerly was known as our Community Schools Office. So we still are in 15 of the Prince George's County Public Schools, middle schools to be exact. But this office also works with the police department we receive the runaway report weekly. And through our mechanisms within the school system, reach out to families whose children have run away to offer resources and services and delve into the reasons why these children are running away. We also, under this office, have multi-service centers. That's where we are co-located with other providers of human services. And those service centers, as you will note, are in Langley Park, the Bridge Center at Adams House, the Solutions Center at Southview, and we are in the American Job Center with Employ Prince George's. Next slide, please. So just to give you an overview of our impact inside school buildings, I wanted to share some data with you and focus specifically on behavioral health services. You'll note there, and this, let me give you the caveat that this is when we were in 45 schools under the community schools programs. And so recently we transitioned the community schools leadership to the school system, but we are still in 15 of the schools offering crisis intervention and services navigation. But in 2019, 2020, over 4,000 children received therapy, received therapeutic services, and 67% of those students met their treatment goals. And that's huge because the earlier we can offer those interventions, the better opportunity we have to mitigate issues in the future with behavioral health issues. The other thing I wanted to note is that over 1,600 students received case management support related to homelessness, group interventions, all kinds of things. And that's intensive case management where we are working with the child and their family. Next slide, please. Also under the prevention umbrella is our family preservation and kinship care services. Family preservation is a program where we do in-home services of children who are at risk of imminent risk of coming into out-of-home placement, foster care. And we do that directly. The department offers those services, and we also work with a contractor to offer those services. We also offer kinship care services, and those services are targeted at families who are taking care of their kin. And again, that is a program that offers visitation, but it also offers resources and, again, service navigation to those families who are trying to keep children out of foster care by taking on their relatives. Next slide, please. Child Protective Services is the part of my agency that does investigations. We do alternative response and an investigative response, and it's determined which response you get is determined by the nature of the allegation of abuse or neglect. And the alternative response gives us an opportunity to get in there and offer that family services without having to have a finding of whether or not they committed abuse or neglect. But it can flip, just so you're clear. We can be in there doing an alternative response, and if we see something that is of concern, then we will turn it into an investigative response. We try to do this in a trauma-focused manner, trauma-informed manner, and work very closely with partners in law enforcement and other service providers when we are investigating issues of sexual abuse and extreme physical abuse, and that's through our Child Advocacy Center. Next slide, please. Foster care is designed to be short-term and offer supportive services to children and their families when we cannot ensure their safety in the home. It's a response of last resort, and more we are being pushed and giving thought to how we offer interventions further upstream so that we prevent families from becoming involved in the foster care system. Recently, the federal government passed legislation, the Families First Prevention Services Act. We are in the midst of implementing this in Maryland, and it gives us additional resources to offer those interventions that I just mentioned further upstream in an evidence-based manner. Previous to this law, the federal government would only reimburse us if the child was in foster care. This gives us the opportunity to get funding from the feds for prevention services. Next slide, please. And so in order to be the leader, I think we have to continuously lean into the work that we're doing and figure out who the children are that we're serving and how we better serve them. So one such example of that is our Affirm program that we operate with the University of Maryland and Human Rights Campaign. And it focuses on our LGBT plus youth and offers them services, but also offers their families and their resource parents additional training and services. And it helped us to train our entire staff on opportunities to improve their interactions with LGBT youth and other customers coming into our agency. Next slide. In 2014, the Prince George's County Model Court, which is comprised of the judicial, PGCDSS, juvenile justice, and many other partners, we implemented the Crossover Youth Program. Crossover youth are those youth who have touched child welfare and then cross over into juvenile justice, or are in juvenile justice and it is determined that child welfare needs to be involved. We have been very successful in offering services to this segment of our caseload. And I just want to highlight for you that we worked with the Center for Juvenile Justice at Georgetown University. We started the work in 2013. What we're really moving towards is one judge, one family. And for this project, one judge hears all the cases involving youth that have crossed over. And we identify the youth at the point they enter either system. DSS and DJS work collaboratively on behalf of the youth and offer coordinated case management for this youth. We work to mitigate foster care bias at the detention and disposition decision. And we maximize the resources of both systems, the juvenile justice system and the child welfare system, on behalf of these youth. And just to put it in a little perspective for you, it's children who are in foster care. Unfortunately, the state is the parent. And I thought about how I felt, how I would feel if my child was standing in front of a judge. I'd be there with my child every step of the way, advocating for them and, doing what's necessary to keep my child out of the system. And so that's the way we went at it. We visited a program in Austin, Texas, a group of us from Prince George's County, judges, CASA, executive director, and we saw their program and we came back and modified it for Prince George's County. Next slide, please. Finally, in our foster care and adoption area, we do what is called Ready by 21, and it's our efforts to prepare our youth for exiting foster care through collaborative work with the courts and other partners. One of the things that we developed in Prince George's County was a checklist that the judges and magistrates use on a regular basis as we go before them in our court hearings to determine what the department is doing and what the youth is doing to get themselves ready for exiting foster care. Next slide, please. Another area that the department leads the county in is around developing systems of care for youth experiencing homelessness. Last year, we were awarded, after several years of competing, we were competitively awarded $1.7 million a year to pour into our programs and services for youth experiencing homelessness. And so as a result of that, we developed a community coordinated plan with many partners. Some of them you would automatically assume, and some of them were non-traditional partners, like Southern Management was at the table with us every step of the way, health department, various partners. And as a result of the work that we've done through the Youth Homeless Demonstration Project, which is very involved, and HUD had to approve our projects. But next slide, on the next slide, you'll see that we will be building capacity to serve youth 24 or younger, with a drop-in center that's coming to the county, some additional street outreach focus on youth, crisis beds, transitional and rapid rehousing. We have a project with University of Maryland and I think Bowie around rapid rehousing for education students, and permanent supportive housing for youth who have somatic, behavioral, or intellectual challenges. So we're really excited about this work and really see this as an opportunity to improve resources for Prince George's youth and through that improve outcomes. Next slide, please. Currently, and the Youth Homeless Demonstration Project is in the works. Like I said, we just got our approval from HUD to move forward with the projects that the team came up with, but we currently have in our portfolio these three entities that offer resources for youth who are experiencing homelessness, as well as we have, I think it's 14 transitional housing beds for youth in our overall transitional housing program. And as a result of YHDP, we'll more than double that capacity. But this is what we currently have to address youth homelessness. Next slide. And then the next slide speaks to our eligibility services, because I really believe that eligibility services are often the big front door opportunity for us to offer and engage with families before they are in a severe crisis. And so I see all of this as part of our child welfare effort. the SNAP program, temporary cash assistance, and EAFC, all are primarily focused on families. Next slide, please. In addition, the department oversees the Affordable Care Act for Prince George's County. The Health Connector entity is a program of the Department of Social Services, and we work closely with the state to get as many Prince Georgians covered with insurance as possible. And then we still oversee Medicaid for special populations such as ineligible immigrants, households receiving Social Security income, and persons age 65 and over. And I think that's my last slide. Next slide. So any questions you have, please.
Thank you, Director Brown. Really appreciate the presentation today. I wanted to, ask a quick question before anyone else hops in here. And please, anyone, if you have a question, just pop in the chat or raise your hand. Can you, what is your budget? What is your county budget for the services that your department offers? And how much of that budget of yours is county-based funds?
So we are a state county agency, and about 87–88% of my staff are state merit employees. So the majority of the programs that we operate are federally mandated down through the state. And so that's where the majority of my budget sits. We also receive funds on the county side, specific number. I think I'm around $6 or $7 million on the county side. And much of that is probably grants that we receive from HUD and other entities that we run through on the county side. I do have general fund dollars, but I think it's less than $5 million.
Your general funds, from my understanding, and obviously you know your budget better than I do, but I know that many of our health and human services departments within the county, including Department of HUD, usually only have about 1% to 2% of their money, of their funds come from the actual county government. So therefore, the investment from the county obviously comes from money funneled through the federal government and the state government, but county original dollars, tax dollars, do not primarily help these services. And I guess that's kind of the point that I'm kind of trying to get here, that we need more of our county dollars invested in health and human services.
Yes, I would agree that the general fund contribution to our budget is minimal.
That was nice. Ms. Oriata for a question.
Yeah, I just have a question around, from a general standpoint, like the services that we provide and comparative to other jurisdictions. I know recently, I believe we got a rating around our human services, which was very low comparatively for what we actually provide. So I'm just wondering, like, when it comes to social services and what we provide on the county, what that looks like comparatively to other jurisdictions.
I'm not sure I know what you're trying to ask me. We provide the same across the state. There are mandated programs that we provide in every jurisdiction, but in Prince George's County, there are several additional programs that we provide that others do not. For instance, we oversee the continuum of care for homelessness, and many of my colleagues across the state do not have that responsibility. As I mentioned earlier, our work around crossover youth is something that we're doing in Prince George's County, and in fact, leading the state in this work. And the work around improving services to our LGBTQ youth is additional work. So I'm not clear. I'm not clear on what your question is.
So you would say that the services that we provide are on par with other jurisdictions and the investment that we put at the county level?
Oh, at the county level, I don't know. I don't know. I know that Montgomery County gets a whole lot more general fund than Prince George's does, but I don't know how it compares to others across the state. Smaller jurisdictions don't even get anything from their local governments or get very little from their local governments. The metros tend to get more, but we've never had a comparison, of what we get from our local governments. But I would say in Prince George's, I think it's, like I said, Montgomery County tends to get more, but I think we're on par with Baltimore County and Anne Arundel.
Okay, thank you. And just because you mentioned it, curious about the LGBTQ outreach for foster care, I did notate that originally that we lost that funding because it was grant-based. So has new funding been allocated towards that, since I saw it in your presentation and you notated it again?
So what part of our plan was when we got the money is that we develop the infrastructure internally to keep the programs and services in place when the grant funds go away. And so we took a couple of positions and made them took a couple of merit positions and changed their job descriptions to allow them to focus on this work full time.
Thank you.
Judge.
I just wanted to say thank you for your presentation and thank you for what you do. I hear a lot about the crossover youth from Judge Martin, and I know you do a great job with that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions, Director Burnett. I know I keep calling you different names, but
so you all, she'll share a copy of this with you, right?
We do have a copy of it. It was actually very nice and well done. So it'll be good for us as we deliberate our recommendations for funding possibilities. So thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay, everybody, we have our next presentation, if I can find it. Our next presentation we're going to have is Mr. Mike Rudinsky. He's the Vice President of the Maryland Association of School Resource Officers. He will do a 10-minute school resource officer overview. And I just want to just say thank you, Mr. Rudinsky, for being here from the great District 22 in Hyattsville.
Thank you. Thank you. So everybody knows, in addition to being the Vice President of the Maryland Association of School Resource Officers, I'm actually a school safety specialist with the Maryland Center for School Safety, and I have been the person charged with the development of the curriculum for school resource officers and the deployment of all of the training for school resource officers since 2019. I'd like to start off thanking you all for taking a look at this and being there for our children, because that's very important to me. And I see some old friends on the call. They know that from my days as a school resource officer in Hyattsville. First slide, please. So in order to understand school resource officers, you first have to understand the two different types of policing. First, we have traditional policing. Traditional policing involves officers answering calls and patrolling their communities, looking for crimes that have occurred and are occurring. If you could go ahead and click, it's reactive. And then one more click. Officers respond to a variety of situations that develop. They spend their shifts addressing challenges and issues they come up with. They're fixers, ladies and gentlemen. Police officers generally go to the scene and they have to fix problems. And they're very good at it. That's what their job is. Next slide. In the 90s, the concept of community policing came about. And we see community policing today, but sometimes we're seeing something a little different. We're seeing community relations. Traditional community policing was actually an overall philosophy of a police department that would get officers out of their cars and into their communities They were taught skill sets in problem solving. And the object was to send them into communities that were having quality of life issues and to allow them to use their skill sets to develop plans in order to bring the community up to a level where they could operate without the quality of life issues, and the police departments could move the special community policing initiative out and everything would be fine. They were to assess that on a regular basis and make sure that it continued to work. It involved partnerships, problem-solving techniques, and proactiveness. Next slide. That, ladies and gentlemen, is actually what school resource officers are trained in. Community policing. The Department of Justice says that they need the skills to build relationships, solve problems, educate the school and community, crime prevention, empower the community, and enforce the law. Next slide. In Maryland, the school-based law enforcement programs that exist, and the timeline is on your screen. You see in 1990, the Baltimore City School Police were brought into the picture. In 1994, Greenbelt Police and Officer Dave Berger. 1998, Baltimore County and Harford County followed, as well as Hyattsville City, and it happened to be yours truly. A year later, 1999, I believe, is when Prince George's County came into the school resource officer program. I recall those officers all had to come spend a day with several of us in the county to learning their positions. We also have school district police, and that's something that Prince George's County kind of realizes because there's a little hybrid situation there where they have SPOs. Their security division has sworn police officers. University and campus police, school security officers, and also liaison officers. Next slide. So in 2018, there was something called the Safe to Learn Act, which many of you were a part of and you know about. The Safe to Learn Act put all kinds of guidelines in effect for the state of Maryland concerning safety in schools, and it actually built the Maryland School Safety Center for School Safety to be what it is today. I happened to be working in entry-level training at the state level when I was tasked to actually develop the curriculum for SROs. This is the first time, and this is very important to understand, this is the first time in the state of Maryland that any definition existed for school resource officer. Up until this point, any police officer or security person in a school could be called a school resource officer because there was no real definition. You see on your screen what the Safe to Learn Act says a school resource officer must be. They have to be a member of a police department recognized by the Annotated Code of Maryland, and they have to be assigned to the school in accordance with a memorandum of understanding with the local school system or a Baltimore City School Police officer. Next slide, please. School security employees are people that are employed by the school system to provide security. So those police officers in Prince George's County that work for the school security department are still considered school security employees. Our program, however, mandated by the Safe to Learn Act, requires that the SROs and the school security employees all receive the same exact training. So they've all received the same training, and actually we trained Prince George's County on June 26th of last year. We had them all in an auditorium together, working with one another to learn each other's jobs. Next slide. The mandates. First of all, the Safe to Learn Act requires use of force oversight for school resource officers. Another important point, because it only applies to school resource officers and school security employees. Any school security employee or resource officer using force on a student in the state of Maryland is required to report that to our agency. We then forward a report of that to the Maryland State Department of Education and eventually up to the governor's office. Now, if police officers respond in and they are not SROs, they do not have to report that use of force. Also, critical life-threatening incidents. When those occur inside of a school. Let's say that there's a serious assault that occurs inside of a school or stabbing, then the local school system must convene a meeting, including our agency. They have to decide best practices to prevent it in the future. They then must provide a report of that meeting to our agency, and within 45 days, we put it in the governor's office. They also put requirements for training, including a timeline and a curriculum. Next slide. And you can go ahead and click a couple times. All of the SROs and SSEs must be trained in the following topics by legislation. I believe you have one more click after this. There you go, back up. So de-escalation, disability and diversity awareness with specific attention to racial and ethnic disparities, maintaining a positive school climate, constructive interactions with students, and implicit bias. I have been training SROs already since 2003 and knew that these are tremendously important topics, but it's not all they needed. They needed a lot more than this. So we convened over 1,200 citizens within the state of Maryland who put input into the curriculum that was eventually developed for the SROs. Next slide. That curriculum is a 40-hour curriculum. And the 40-hour curriculum, as you see, contains many specialties that police officers and police trainers just were not able to come up with or to train. For that reason, we solicited some of the same experts that we had talked to develop the curriculum. And, you know, bless us, they have stuck with us and trained all of the SROs and school security in the state in multiple topics. If you go ahead and click, you will see the topics that are trained to the SROs and the school security employees by experts. Victimization of youth in schools, the teen brain, youth development, hate, bias and hate crimes just went into effect this class. I have 42 people in a virtual class right now. First time it went into effect because October 1st, it became law that all police officers must have that training within every 3 years. Implicit bias. We use a program called Fair and Impartial Policing, which teaches officers not only to recognize their own bias, but the fact that everybody contains bias within them. So when they're investigating incidents, they have to take into consideration each level of bias that could be there, from the people involved in the incident to the people that may have come across the incident to the officers themselves. Restorative practices, trauma-informed care, again, the disability and diversity awareness, all of the things that we know the SROs need in today's world to keep our young people from entering the system. And I know that seems foreign, but that's what we're trying to do. Next page.
Hey, Mr. Rudinsky,
yes.
Yeah, 2 more minutes, sir.
Okay, you can skip this. Click 4 times. These are the roles of the SRO in a school. It should be noted on this slide that the very last thing we ask them to do is law enforcement. They're to find out what's best for the school and best for the student, then decide where to go from there. Next slide. Next slide. Arrest, very important. We train our officers and we train the public about the mays and shalls, the things that officers must arrest for and the things they may arrest for. Many people don't know these things. There's current research ongoing for this class and for the data surrounding officers' arrests. We found that there's, and I think you know because I heard the school board meeting, we found that it wasn't all SROs that were making the arrest. We also found that there was never a comparison through the totality of incidents and the totality of arrests. So we don't know if it's only been the things rising to a higher level that we're arrested for or not. Next slide. I think we're about done here. Next slide. We are.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Right on time. Right on time.
I try.
Yeah, well, thank you for the presentation, Sergeant Rudinsky. You know, can I just ask you a quick question? On one of the slides, you kind of went quick, but I reviewed them earlier, and it had something on there about use of force use of force reporting
Yes.
requirement. And our school system just said that they don't have those numbers on use of force because they're police officers. They have them only at the police department. Can you just describe where is that requirement? Is that just general orders?
No.
Departments, or what is that?
It's in the Safe to Learn Act. We actually had a meeting with multiple police chiefs, including Chief Stawinski, and they decided on what information should be in the report. Now, the reporting requirements just went into effect. We are still collecting the requirements for, I believe, the last quarter of last year. It is required that both the local school system and the police department that has an SRO each submit separate reports to us. And that creates checks and balances as well. So we're getting information. So
you have the information for Prince George's County then?
I believe that it has been submitted. I'm not the data person, but I can tell you that 2 weeks ago, I did reach out to our police departments to make sure it was turned in, and my emails went crazy. So I think our data person has that.
Can you make sure, can you send that to us? Can you reach out to your data folks and get that information to us, please?
I will do my best to do that, yes.
That doesn't sound like a commitment, but okay, thank you.
Well, it's because I have to depend on another human being, that's all. If I had it in my hands, I would get it for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Mr. Rudinsky and I known each other for a very long time, everybody. So,
yes.
Judge Lamassey.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. It was great.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you say that the school security officers had no obligation to report the use of force, just the SROs?
No, ma'am. It has to be reported by both the local school system and the police department that has SROs. Both need to report.
Okay. Thank you. It wasn't clear.
Mr. Pastor Robinson.
I'm sorry, Judge Maureen was asking the same question I had, because I thought I heard you say, Ms. Rudinsky, that officers that are not school resource officers do not have to report use of force.
That is outside officers. So if a police department has an officer from outside that responds into the school, there's no requirement that they have to report. However, any school resource officer or any employed school security employee must report.
Okay. Mr. Ivey.
Well, thank you. Let me say it's great to see you after all these years, and I want to commend you for the great work you did while I was, involved, and I'm find it very reassuring that you're in the position you're in now. I did want to ask you a quick question though. So I remember you were from the Hyattsville Police Department.
Yes, sir.
And I guess is there a difference between municipalities providing officers versus Prince George's, PGPD, or do the same rules apply, or how does it work?
The same rules apply. What we're working out now, understand that this is something I'm trying to let people understand. It's a fledgling program in Maryland. We actually put the first certified police officers into school September 1st of last year, and then COVID hit. So we really don't have data as to how our program's working because schools closed immediately. Now, all municipal officers and county officers or state police all fall under the same exact guidelines. The problem has actually been corralling them all and figuring out who actually had SROs in schools. And we've now done a good job. We actually now have a monthly call where all of the SRO supervisors from every agency in the state network and join the call. So we've pretty much identified all of them.
All right, thank you, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, sir.
Miss Oriana.
You can call me Crystal. Thank you for the presentation. And this is such an interesting and important topic. And one of the things I think that's been crucial for this conversation is there's always like the framing of like on paper what SROs are supposed to be, like counselors and etc. I always think there's a difference between what something is on paper and then the reality of what's manifested. So I'm just curious about how are we checking that? Is there surveys? What mechanism are you using to measure what you're saying SROs are supposed to be versus like reality of what they might be and any unintended consequences?
Well, thank you for the question. If you recall, I just told Mr. Ivy that, in fact, we don't have data because it's a fledgling program. We only have data before that. So one of the things that we know, and I have 17 years experience as an SRO, one of the things that we know, and I knew myself, my supervisors never came into the school and really didn't know what I did. And that became a problem. It's a problem that manifested itself today, and we know that. So we have built a program called Understanding the Role of the School Resource Officer. That program addresses new supervisors to the SRO programs to let them know what they're supposed to be looking for. And it also is for school administrators, because we know now, and we're developing more data, that the majority of the times SROs are involved with students and make arrests. It's been requested by an administrator. We're finding that out in each county as time moves forward. So we use this program to train the administrators to better work with the SROs and train the supervisors what the SROs should do. We did the program yesterday, and I told you it's a fledgling program. Well, that understanding program is even newer. We presented to over 18 states yesterday because no other state is doing that yet. So we're trying to train them. And once we train them, hopefully we can get some things in place that would better control exactly what they look like on paper and if they're carrying that out. And one of those things that we suggest is that supervisors have the school supervisors, the principal has some supervision over the SRO. Also that the police departments have a column of supervision over an SRO unit rather than dispersed throughout. So we're trying. We know that it's always been a challenge, and we're trying to make it better.
So up until this point, because SROs are not new, like country, like around the country, right?
Right.
So you're saying that up to this point, there has not been that mechanism, but now you guys are working on a mechanism to do that.
In Maryland, in the state of Maryland, because of the Safe to Learn Act, we have put into place social and emotional learning objectives for the school resource officers and for the school resource officers to use. Generally on the national-based training platforms, they don't exist. So the trauma-informed care, the restorative practices, the behavioral threat assessment, those things are generally not taught in basic school resource officer courses. They're taught more in mental health type of school resource officer courses. Well, we're training all of our SROs in that. That's where Maryland's different than the other states.
Mr. Rudinsky, thank you for being here. My last question is, can you give us the person's contact information who handles the data at the center?
I can give you his contact information. His name is Jayan.
You can place it in the chat here,
Gabriel.
or you can respond to the email later.
I'll be glad to place it in the chat for you once I'm off, because I have to look it up on my email.
Fair enough. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. We really appreciate the presentation, and good to see you as always, Mr. Hyde.
Thank you.
I feel the same.
Okay, so we have our last presentation today, everybody. I'm excited to introduce this group of presenters. We have Miss R.T. Sidihu and Miss Megan Berger, who are co-leads of the Maryland Coalition to Reform School Discipline. They will be supporting the movement of police-free schools and presenting on their platform. So I wanted to thank you, ladies, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. First, I want to thank you for the opportunity to have us here to speak about our work. And if we could just have the PowerPoint pulled up.
And I'm sorry, it's going to be 10-minute presentation, okay?
Okay, great. We will work hard on that. We can go to the next slide. I'd just like to introduce myself briefly. My name is Arti Sidhu. I'm the chair of the Maryland Coalition to Reform School Discipline, and I have my colleague here as well, Megan Berger, who you'll hear from in a bit. She's one of our committee chairs, and she works at Disability Rights Maryland. I want to highlight just really quickly why we're both here, and that's because we care about this issue. We are both attorneys, and we represent students that have been removed from school in various disciplinary actions like suspensions, expulsions, other illegal removals or push out. So we represent students that have interacted with law enforcement and that have been arrested. So we see these instances firsthand. We see how it impacts them. We see the trauma and the negativity that it brings. And that's what brings us here. I will not read this list out loud in the interest of time, but our members are listed on this slide for you to see that we have a broad membership. It's interdisciplinary. It's across the entire state of Maryland with a number of partners in PG County itself. So you could take a second to review that. And just in case anyone has any questions or wants to reach out to any one of our partners, we're all listed here. We're also both a part of the Maryland Suspension Representation Project. And I just wanted to highlight that briefly because through that partnership, we represent students across the state of Maryland that have been removed illegally or maybe not illegally, but been removed in various ways across the state that deserve and require representation from attorneys. And our highest call volume for removals is from PG County. So we feel like that's very important to highlight considering exclusionary discipline has been part of this conversation and often goes along with part of the conversation when we're talking about SROs and arrests. Next slide. I just want to highlight here, I'm not going to read off the slide because you have it right in front of you, but we're here because this is a huge concern with the school to prison pipeline. And in 2017, following House Bill, I believe 1287, we have a commission that came together, the Commission on the School to Prison Pipeline and Restorative Practices that I believe Delegate Washington sat on, so thank you for your service, Delegate, to evaluate the issue of discipline in Maryland schools. And they highlighted that one of 5 factors that perpetuate the pipeline is increased school police presence. So that's incredibly important. If you haven't read the report, I really recommend it. It's linked on this slide. And the reason that this perpetuates the pipeline is because discipline, it becomes outsourced to law enforcement. And it really shouldn't be. Discipline should remain in the school with teachers and administrators and educators. We shouldn't be criminalizing childlike behavior, age-appropriate behavior. Not only does this send students into the juvenile and criminal justice system, but there's also a psychological impact of that. There's a trauma that lasts with that. And there's just an impression that these children are doing something wrong when really they're just children. And as we all know well, I think, Black students and students with disabilities are disproportionately impacted by the school to prison pipeline. So this report was released in December of 2018 after 18 months of work by this commission that was comprised of, I think, over 20 individuals that studied various policies and practices across the state. They reviewed empirical data. They gathered testimony from various experts, students, and communities, teachers, administrators alike, all across the state. So I don't think that we need to reinvent the wheel here with the work and the research. So definitely refer to this report if you're able to. Next slide, please. And next slide as well. So police do not represent safety in schools. It's one of the biggest reasons that you hear of why we have police in schools. It's to keep them safe. But as I just very briefly highlighted, police presence criminalizes age-appropriate behavior in schools. And there's a report that's linked here from Godfredson, but there's a new report as well that I don't know if everyone will get a copy of this PowerPoint, but at the end, all of the resources are listed. So there is a Godfredson report that was released this year that shows the exact conclusion was that police do not represent safety in schools. So that's really what we want to highlight here. Schools are not just tasked with educating our youth on academics, but social emotional learning is a very important part of school. Our students spend most of their days at school. Hopefully once COVID is over, they will spend most of their days at school physically. And this is the time that they have to learn from their mistakes and to build these social emotional skills. And educators and administrators should be the ones that intervene and take these teachable moments when students' behavior may not be exactly what we want it to be. Police officers are not the right people to do this. They are not the ideal mentors in this space. And so I just wanted to highlight that briefly. As we can see here, 61% of school-based arrests are not for those violent instances that we hear that happen rarely. They're for fights that don't involve weapons. They're for other interpersonal conflicts and disruption. We've seen disruption could be something as simple as a student not sitting in their assigned seat, or eloping from their classroom, or making an unexpected noise. So these are not things that we need police involvement for. And in national studies, we've seen that students in schools with police officers are 5 times more likely to be arrested for disorderly conduct and twice as likely to be referred to law enforcement for fighting than students that in schools without an SRO. Next slide, please. So we've actually already seen this information in tonight's presentation. I believe that PG County has security officers that have arresting powers. They're the only school system in Maryland that have these security officers. And as we heard earlier, they do account for most of the school-based arrests here. I won't belabor the point since we have heard this. And I will say that I really appreciate the earlier presentation where they owned these numbers and they acknowledged that this needs to get better. So that's a great step. The last thing I'll say on this is that these officers are no different than SROs. I understand that in the school walls, I understand there are differences, but for sake of this data, they are no different. They have arrest powers and they shouldn't. They aren't educators, they aren't administrators. They become disciplinarians, and they're increasing student involvement with law enforcement, regardless of what their technical name is. Next slide, please. Now, we talked just briefly about the disproportionality before. I just wanted to give you all a few numbers here that Black students in PG County received 80% of school-based arrests, despite representing only 50% of the student population. And we know that behavior is not different of Black students versus white versus other. So that's a glaring number. Additionally, students with disabilities with IEPs received 20% of school-based arrests, despite comprising 11% of the student population, and students with disabilities with 504 plans received an additional 14 arrests. This is not even capturing students with disabilities that are not diagnosed or for students that do not have IEPs yet. So it's important to know that there could be even more students that are being criminalized for their behavior that they have no control over because of a disability. And I'm going to turn it over to Megan Berger, since she is one of our disability rights attorneys. She's going to share a quick story about a client that she represented and then take over for the presentation. Thank you again.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having us as part of this important conversation. I'm going to try and go quickly since we're running out of time. So I've represented many students in Prince George's County Public Schools who have reported being hounded and tracked by school security, threatened with handcuffs, and many students who have, in fact, been handcuffed at school and arrested. For students with disabilities, often it's their nonviolent but non-traditional behavior and disability-related behavior that ends up being criminalized. One client's story I want to briefly share. This was a student, and this was in Baltimore County Public Schools, but I think it really clearly captures the harm that police presence can have for students. So this was a middle school student last year, 2019, a student with autism. He eloped from his classroom to an empty classroom. School staff responded to him, was trying to convince him to return from an empty classroom back to his classroom where instruction was happening. He was refusing. The school staff radioed to the school resource officer. The school resource officer responded. And I watched this video, and you can see that the incident starts escalating. The student is sort of dragged down the hallway by the school resource officer and school staff into a seclusion type room. And in that room, the school resource officer handcuffs the student. He's handcuffed and restrained for over 30 minutes. He's screaming and crying the entire time, begging for handcuffs to be taken off. And there is video of this, and there was recent media on this. So we could send the link and you can see the video, but
it's actually linked on this slide as well.
Okay.
So hopefully you'll get the presentation.
Okay, and so he was taken to the hospital after this incident and had a fractured wrist, and he was diagnosed with PTSD, and then of course was fearful of returning to school. And so that's just, this was a school resource officer who had gone through the 40 hours of training, and it's just a clear example of the real harm and threat of police violence that does exist when we have police officers embedded in our schools, and when school staff and administrators can sort of default and rely to the police officers embedded in the schools to respond to student behavior, regular routine student behavior that school staff and administrators should be handling on their own and using as a teaching a moment and teaching social emotional skills. Next slide, please. So we know that we've talked about the harms of police presence in schools, and so what are the positives of school police? Proponents of school police often cite student safety as the primary justification for having police in schools. However, there's no reliable evidence in Maryland or elsewhere that police presence reduces school violence. There's no empirical evidence or data that police presence will prevent a mass shooting from occurring or prevent an outside threat. One study found that an increase in police presence did not decrease any category of school-based offenses. Students' perception that police treat them unfairly can, however, have a counterproductive effect on student behavior. And there's studies demonstrating that school police have made Black students feel less safe because of over-policing and racialized police violence. So there's no reliable evidence that school police are an effective strategy or program for keeping them safe, but we have a lot of empirical evidence and data showing the harms. Next slide, please. Next slide. So as this work group considers how to transform public safety, schools are really the very first place to remove police presence. There's a culture clash between law enforcement and the learning environment. Police enforce criminal laws while schools are supposed to nurture students. We also wanted to point out that data from DJS shows that when schools physically closed last spring because of COVID, there was a 47% decline in juvenile arrests in Prince George's County compared to the same period last year. And a significant contributor to this decline is likely that youth were not being exposed to police at school. Next slide, please. I will quickly go over this slide because we've heard this information several times this evening. What I do want to highlight is that Prince George's County Public Schools spend $17 million total on school security and the total spent on SROs from the county was $4.32 million. Next slide, please. Next slide. So what are effective ways to keep schools safe? Educators, researchers, and law enforcement have found that supporting students' positive behavior, strengthening relationships among students, staff, and parents, and de-escalating conflicts are most effective. Proven and evidence-based strategies include restorative and transformative justice practices, more counselors, school psychologists, social workers, behavioral specialists, trauma-informed practices, wraparound services, special education planning, and social emotional learning. I do want to point out that the Open Society Institute of Baltimore just released a study, a really promising study on restorative practices. Johns Hopkins University did a study of restorative practice schools in Baltimore City public schools, and they found that after a year of restorative practices being implemented on a whole school-based restorative practices, suspensions were reduced by 44%. So we did link to that study at the end of this presentation. And so these are the evidence-based effective ways that we know actually keep schools safe. Next slide, please. And so we know that Prince George's County Education Association supports removing police from schools. And this is just a quote from them. And it's very clear that they support removing police from schools. They're concerned about funneling children into the school to prison pipeline, and that what's needed is restorative practices and a more reasonable professional school counselor to student ratio. Next slide, please. So the ratio of students to counselors in Prince George's County Public Schools is 362 to 1, far beyond the American School Counselors Association recommended ratio of 250 to 1. The ratio of students to school psychologists in Prince George's County is 1,346 to 1, but the recommended ratio is 1,000 to 1. The county can and should redirect the funds for school police officers away from police departments and towards the school system and the community to invest in supportive strategies. And Prince George's County Public Schools can and should redirect the $17 million it spends on security officers, security assistants, and its security budget towards supportive strategies. Next slide, please. So a case study of a successful school police removal. So Toronto's largest school district, which serves nearly 250,000 students, ended its police program in 2017. After concerns were raised by activists, school trustees put the policing program on hold to survey students. Focus groups were conducted with students and former students who had interactions with police, specifically students who had been handcuffed at school or involved in the juvenile justice system. And what's really interesting about what Toronto did is that the district officials waited and put greater stock in what students who had actually been impacted by school police, those students who had been arrested, who did have contact with the juvenile justice system, their input was weighted more, even though they were a minority of students. And so the trustees stated they listened to the marginalized voices that have not always been heard, and they heard loud and clear that the students did not want school resource officers present. Post-police removal, there has been a decrease in suspensions and expulsions and no serious safety issues reported. So what Toronto did instead of school police, because that's always the question, okay, well, we're gonna take school police out, you want us to take police out, and then what? Then what are the effective alternatives? And so what Toronto did was they put unarmed sort of school safety monitors. And so, for instance, each high school had an unarmed school safety monitor. If schools were having sort of an uptick in negative behaviors, they could request and get a second school safety monitor. The school system also had school engagement teams with the local police department. So they still were working with the local police department and had school engagement teams, but the difference was that the police were not embedded in the schools. And that, that is really sort of the crux of the issue, because when police are embedded in schools, contrary to the perception that they're building relationships, but we know from the data that they end up criminalizing school discipline, and students are disproportionately arrested, and incidents of code of conduct offenses increase when police are embedded in schools.
Okay, I gotta hop in here. You got one more slide left, but if we hit our 7 o'clock mark.
Okay. And so our last slide is just that we are, we're really excited to be part of this conversation and grateful to be part of the conversation. And there's a lot of local leaders in the community that we urge, this work group to engage with you if you haven't already. And that's sort of a list of some of the local groups working on this issue. And of course, impacted youth, we encourage the work group to reach out to impacted youth and families.
No, thank you very much, and thank you for recognizing me in the work that I've done on this subject matter. Really appreciate it. I want to take the first. We got 2 questions here. Let's take the first question from Ms. Florence Felix Lawson.
Thank you, Delegate. My question actually was answered somewhat by the last couple of slides where you discussed Toronto removing the school officers, because I specifically wanted to know if there were any jurisdiction who had school resource officers and had them removed, and what did the data show? I guess my question then would be, is if we know of any school districts in our region who did that, and if there's any data to show subsequently what happened in those schools.
Right, so So Toronto is, the case study because they removed school police in 2017. That's sort of, they are a good example because we know their suspensions decreased and we know what they did and what they put in place of. And then we also know, of course, after the events of this summer, many school districts across the country have voted to remove school police. And it's, at this point there isn't a lot of data because, all of those school districts are, in the process of revamping, their school systems. But I think what we do know, the evidence is really clear. We know what are effective alternatives. We know that restorative practices, more nurses, more counselors, trauma-informed practices, we know from the evidence that those things work. And we know that we do not have evidence that police make schools safer. And in fact, they have unintended consequences of harming, especially our students of color and students with disabilities.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ivy.
Two quick questions. Well, maybe they're quick. One is the line you're drawing that, you can have security officers there, but you don't want them to have police powers and arrest powers. Is that the main distinction, or is there something in addition to that?
So at this point, the distinction is, yes, the arrest powers, because that's what is, that's what's, funneling children into the school to prison pipeline and criminalizing discipline. And so I think that's why, we're advocating for the school resource officers and the school security with arrest powers. And, I think it's interesting, and I was listening to, it's a very interesting conversation, and in Prince George's County Public Schools, the greatest number of arrests are coming from school security. And they're, of course, they're most embedded in the schools, right? And that only makes sense because they're there completely embedded. And in the most recent study that came out from Godfredson, who actually is a University of Maryland professor, and she did a study on schools in California, we've linked it in our resources, but that found that when SRO presence is increased in schools, the rate of certain offenses increase. And that really only makes sense. And that sort of bears out in Prince George's County's own data about school security officers having the greatest number of arrests because they're most embedded in the school system.
And we did talk earlier briefly in other presentations about calls still being made to 911. That's going to happen, and we're not saying that that shouldn't happen in dire instances where it's needed, but there needs to be a plan in place. Similar to how I noted Toronto at school engagement teams, because I know that's a concern of, the general police force isn't going to have the training and the youth development and these types of things to be able to go into the school. We're going to need to identify a plan for that to work in those instances that they need to be called. Being placed physically at the school is just different. So we're not saying that they should never be called and should not be included.
Okay, you broke up a little on me there, but you actually were touching on the second question, which is, you heard what she said, which surprised me, frankly. I guess I'd never thought that the issue might be not whether you have police in the schools or not, but are we going to have police showing up on 911 calls versus police who were there? And her take on Ms. Goldson's was she'd rather have somebody there who, she knew or knew the students or both, as opposed to somebody rolling up in the squad car with the siren on. What's your take on that?
Sure. I mean, personally, I'd have to say, I wish I knew more about those calls and what they were for. Because what I can say is that when someone is stationed at the school, they're going to be more arrests for more trivial offenses. That's what we're trying to get away from. But with that being said, we're not against some sort of security in the school. So there can still be someone that's there that's tasked with kind of having a pulse on what's going on and, being part of the community, knowing the students, all of these things, and they can serve as a liaison perhaps. But to be honest, this isn't something that we have fully evaluated. So we can definitely talk about that more and get back to you on that. But my thought is that someone else in the school could serve that purpose of being that liaison and communicating those things to an officer when they arrive at the school. But I'd be really curious to see what those calls were for, because I was alarmed by those numbers as well.
Thank you.
I think that just to tack on is that when police are in the schools, it's far too easy for school staff and administrators to default and to rely on them. So it's, from sort of our examples of, a student eloping or just a regular schoolyard fight or disruptive behavior, you're not necessarily going to call 911 for that, because the SRO is there and you have those relationships. The administrators and school staff just default to calling them, and then the SROs, their primary tool is their arrest power, and they're there to arrest, and they're there to look for criminal activity. And so, the intentions of SROs are of course good. We're not, we know that the intentions are good, but it's the unintended consequences of being there and criminalizing school discipline.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna ask if one person from the duo can answer Miss Oriada's question. Her question.
Thank you for that. No, thank you so much for your presentation and that work that you guys do. And as everyone knows, that I'm obviously an ally on this issue. Comment though for what you brought up, Mr. Ivy. I think that point of saying it's better to know the officer at the school leads to this kind of dialogue of why we're here, that we shouldn't have the need to handpick certain officers that are able to work with children and to work with community members, but the standard should be all of the officers that have the honor of wearing a badge and gun are able, trained to deal with every resident, child or adult. But the question I had was about that transition in Toronto. I'm curious if as they moved over from SROs, did they start from scratch? Did they just remove arresting power from those? So if we were to transition that here in Prince George's County, would the recommendation be for the security officers that are on site to remove their arresting power and retrain? Or would the recommendation be to start from scratch because of maybe some of those habits that already have been ingrained with the current security officers on site?
I don't want to, not knowing sort of all, the specifics of Prince George's County Public Schools and all of the data. I don't want to, come out and say one way or the other. I think, we linked to the Toronto study, and they, they're using unarmed school safety monitors, and then they do also have relationships, with the police departments, but they aren't embedded. But so I would definitely, urge everyone to read that article and that case study. And in terms of the exact steps that need to be taken in Prince George's County Public Schools and what that transition would look like, I'm not going to weigh in on that.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I know that following the removal of the police, they had unarmed school safety monitors in place, but it sounds like even while they were surveying and making this decision that they suspended their police program. So I don't have the exact answer for you, but we can certainly look into that some more and get back to you as well, because I'm curious about it as well. We came upon it somewhat recently, this program in Toronto.
Thank you both. And if one of you can respond to if one of you can respond to, Pastor Robinson's question.
Yes, just real quick. My question is right along the same lines with Crystal. If you knew any of the restorative practices that they put in place in order to drop those numbers, did you compile any of that information with the Canadian model?
So the restorative practices study comes out of Baltimore City Public Schools, the Open Society Institute. They contracted with Johns Hopkins University to do a study on the implementation of restorative practices in their, I think their sort of 40 some schools that they were trialing restorative practices on. And so Johns Hopkins did the study that showed a 44% drop in suspensions. And that separate from the Toronto study where they removed school police and put in unarmed school safety monitors.
Okay, thank you, I appreciate it.
All right, last question, Mr. Lotridge.
Oh, last question, yay. All right. So we heard earlier that the school is trying to reduce arrests, but also that the arrests are happening. They're trying, after a child is arrested, they're hoping to have more diversion. One of the reasons we're having the conversations about arrests and the effect, not only do children feel like they're being policed as opposed to protected, but is because of the school to prison pipeline. I want your take. Diversion, after a child's been arrested and processed, even if he's taken to diversion, does that interrupt that process that we're calling the pipeline to prison? Or are they still on the same track having gone through the entire process, even if they are diverted?
So honestly, it's part of the same process. You're talking about a diversion program that's out of a state's attorney's office. It's law enforcement. And even when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, people like to look at arrest numbers, which are very important. I don't want to downplay that. But when you're looking at the school to prison pipeline, it's not just those physical arrests, it's paper arrests, it's referrals to law enforcement, it's any interaction with the police, it's any perception, and like we talked about, that certain students feel less safe with police being there. So is a diversion program better than nothing? Sure. Is it still part of the pipeline when it's coming out of a law enforcement agency? Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We appreciate the presentation from you both. It was very enlightening, and we appreciate the recommendations that you have for the group as well. So those were, and the study in Toronto, I thought that was fantastic as well to hear and to see. So thank you for the evidence-based information. Thank you both. And I just want to thank all of our members for staying on for this 3-hour marathon. I hope you get used to it, because we are going to be having a lot more of these meetings as we enter into the phase of voting for our recommendations and making our recommendations. I know they're going to be long meetings, so just get used to this a little bit. And I promise to have a 10-minute break in there for you. With that said, Judge Lemassney, any closing comments or?
I would like to thank Delegate Washington for arranging all these speakers. I thought it was a great program, and I know I learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to seeing all the recommendations that come out.
Yeah, right. Thank you, Judge. I appreciate the acknowledgement, and I just wanted to let everybody know on the work group that we would like for you to get your personal, because we all know that some of you have your own recommendations that you would like to propose to the work group. So start filling those out, start working those through, so that, and then I ask you to send those. We're going to give you a deadline for when to submit those to myself and the judge and the subcommittee chairs. But I encourage you to start doing those now, because there will be a deadline, and after that we will not be accepting any new recommendations for the subcommittees and the judge not to consider. So we'll get back to you with the deadlines and with the potential next steps. Next week, just for folks at home and our membership here, we're going to be hearing from advocates in the policing community and advocates who have been in the policy advocacy space, including ACLU, Mr. Green's family, and a few others that we'll see, like CASA and CARE and a few others. So I wanted to let you know that we'll be starting, I think, at the same time next week at 4 o'clock. So we will be starting at 4 o'clock. Thank you, Judge. We will be starting at 4 o'clock next week at the same time on Thursday. The subcommittee meetings are the same as well. Talk to your subcommittee chair about those meetings. And I see Ms. Morning has a quick question before we all adjourn and get something to eat.
Yes. Could we also make sure that we invite Leonard Shan's family?
So the speaker lineup, and that's a great suggestion, Ms. Morning. The speaker lineup has been completed for next week and filled. But let me get back to you on that one, but it has been filled, just to let you know.
Yeah, because I think that's very important. They lost a family member too, and this was a part of mental illness that, you know, I just feel that it's important that we hear from, you know, people who have lost family members. You know, I'm just, like I said, she has told me that she wants to be to actually meet with the committee and everything. Like I said, the community comes to me. So she said she wants to actually be able to speak just like the Green family, because she lost her brother.
Thank you, Ms. Morning. We'll take that in consideration, and I appreciate you recommending that to us. Okay. Any other questions before we adjourn? Seeing none, thank you all, and we will see you all.
Have a great weekend. See you next
Thank you.
week. Bye-bye. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.